Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am joined by a very special guest. I'm joined by Darryl from Final Fantasy Union. You guys love every time that Darryl is on here, so I had to have him back because just recently Final Fantasy 16 has come out. Not only that, we recently got a brand new trailer for Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth. There's a lot of stuff happening with Final Fantasy right now. It's actually insane to keep track of, especially when you consider the rumors of like Final Fantasy 9 Remake, Final Fantasy Tactics. Final Fantasy is really going places at the moment. So I wanted to have someone on here who has some of the greatest knowledge on this series that I know. Darryl, say hello, introduce yourself, and explain FF Union for those who are somehow unaware.
Hi, my name is Darryl. I co-founded Final Fantasy Union with my lovely wife, and I am the voice of the channel now, as well as the brain, typically behind most of the scripts. We do tons of content, typically around like the nostalgic side of things. So we'll reminisce about certain characters, and we'll look at how certain topics or themes have changed over the last 30 odd years. And typically we're known for our granular style, so we go a lot more into the weeds with these topics than most people care to do so. But most people seem to find it interesting, so that's why we are where we are.
Yeah, for sure. You guys make content that I feel like there is just basically no one else on YouTube that I personally know of making content on Final Fantasy in quite the way you guys are. It's something that's really special, and you guys also tackle a lot of topics in a certain depth and nuance that I feel like just absolutely no one else is going to tackle in that way. And I think you guys create a lot of awesome, unique value in doing that. So I want to start. Pleasure's all mine. So I want to start with last time we chatted. We had not seen the new trailer for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. What are your thoughts on the trailer, especially that intriguing opening scene where it appears that the party is already deceased?
I thought the trailer was very interesting. It was great, obviously, for kind of the fans who are super invested into the story, because it's kind of similar to the teaser trailer we had last year, right? They threw some really abstract concepts in there, didn't really explain too much about what was going on. And obviously you saw what happened straight away. It's that all of the theory crafters were going like, this confirms everything I've been saying for years. And then no matter what angle those theory crafters were coming from, everyone was right, essentially. And then they were saying that everyone else is wrong, and for like stoking up the fan base and getting everyone excited again, I thought it was fantastic. They did a great job of that. But the trailer also didn't really show that much at the same time. It was quite contained. We didn't really learn anything really outside of what we'd kind of already known or had expected to see. We saw a couple of saw Red 13, obviously like a playable character now, great. We've seen that some of the ability sets are being changed around, and obviously some new locations that we're going to go to. But it didn't really show us that much, which I guess at this point in time isn't too surprising. It was kind of like a reintroduction of the game ahead of what we can assume. I mean, like, game's coming out in Q1 2024, right? It's basically 6 months away ish now. So you've got to assume that the hype cycle is going to really kick into gear. And like, if you think about Rebirth, they had that sort of May state of play reveal where they introduced Tifa, and then at E3 they had like the big shebang, like here's the full-on trailer. They had the on-stage presentation with Kataze where they did like a huge granular breakdown of the combat system, how it all works. They ran through like the opening bombing mission, and they had it available to play on the show floor as well by anyone who was there. And from there, like, really kind of kicked into gear. But again, like they didn't really show that much of the actual game. Most of their marketing was focused on like the first couple of hours of the experience, and then obviously like, you know, weeks before they started showing more stuff like, oh, here's Sephiroth and all this kind of stuff. But for the most part, it was quite self-contained. I'd imagine they're going to do something similar this time around. What I would say is that I thought the trailer was quite gatekeepy. So like if you are not a Final Fantasy VII or a remake fan, then I don't really know how that trailer was meant to appeal to you. Because there was so much assumed knowledge about what was going on. It didn't really, like, you know, if you're someone who's just coming in from the outside, like what is going on, right? It doesn't really, and it's hard when you've got those kind of like sequel based games that you've got to try and sell to both sets of audiences. And I think that's what I'm probably most curious about, is how they're going to do that moving forward. Because obviously they want this version to sell more than the last one, and the only way they're going to do that if they get more people interested in it than they had in the first one, which I think is going to be hard to do.
Right. Especially because, and this was kind of the one of the things with the first game too, is that I feel like it required a lot of knowledge on Final Fantasy VII to get a lot of the higher level stuff that they were trying to pull with the sequel aspects of it. And I know that they really, really want Rebirth to sell more. They're even talking about, oh, you don't even need to play Remake in order to get Rebirth. Now that's kind of standard PR talk in a way, right?
That's the Guitars in Nomura line. I mean, they even said that with Lightning Returns. That's why they changed the name of the game, because they didn't want people to think it was overtly connected.
Right.
That worked out really well for them.
Kingdom Hearts 3 was also another time they did it, where they were like, Kingdom Hearts 3 can be your first game. Now, technically, I mean, any game in a series can be your first game, right? Like, I've come in on series completely late into a newer entry, and then not really have known entirely like what's going on. And sometimes I'll be so fascinated by like what is happening that I will kind of go back and kind of investigate everything that came before it. So it's not technically wrong in that sense. I do think that there is actually some value in it, and it's not impossible too, because we've seen titles do it before. You know, we've seen God of War. You know,
Mass Effect was a great example. Assassin's Creed, every numbered one sold more than the previous one.
Right.
So yeah, it's definitely possible, and it's definitely happened. But Square have never managed it before.
Right. And in fact,
with Final Fantasy at least.
Right. With their because they've done it with Nier. And I want to say they may have done it with Dragon Quest. I'm pretty sure Dragon Quest 11 was like their highest selling Dragon Quest. Am I wrong?
Potentially. I know 9 sold really well though.
Oh yeah, because it was on DS.
Yeah. I mean, 11 was on DS too, right? So
yeah, it was on 3DS. Yeah.
Split console sales. I think Dragon Quest 11 is one of the best-selling games that Square Enix has ever produced. But I think 9 may also be up there quite high as well.
Right. And so, yeah, it is something that, like with other series, they've managed to do quite well. But see, with Final Fantasy, they're still struggling to get past OG FF7, which has become like the ceiling for them, that they're still trying to pursue, right? They're still trying to think, like, how can we possibly make something that will sell more than Final Fantasy 7 OG? And basically nothing's really done it inside of Final Fantasy.
And the scary thing is that 15 is the game that has probably got the best shot. I mean, if we're talking about like an original platforms releases, like 15 it's got to be close to like 10.5, 11 million now, which is either very close or maybe has surpassed what Final Fantasy accomplished in its original run, essentially. I think 14's up to 7's up to about 14 million now, I think, total. But I mean, like 15, if it continues that its trajectory and gets re-releases in the future on future platform and stuff, has the potential to surpass 7 probably more than any other game in the franchise, which is it's weird, right? It's very weird, because it's not even
it's not even close to being the most well-received game post 7.
No, it is constantly at the bottom of every, near the bottom of most tier lists, and it didn't review particularly well. They just did a fantastic job of marketing that game and just pushing it in every way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and that just goes to show, because I'm pretty sure, I mean, I it's hard to imagine that they don't come out with, say, a PS5 version of the game at some point, and maybe it looks like Windows Edition, and it has all the DLC, including Arden and maybe some other. I mean, it's an easy sell, right? And I expect the same thing for the 13 trilogy. And at that point, I feel like there's almost no way that 15 isn't going to clear probably the highest selling entry in the franchise at that point.
Yeah, if they handled it correctly, it's very conceivable for that to happen. I mean, the only one that was kind of close is 10, but it's kind of hard to tell what that's actually sold, because the sales often get grouped together with 10-2.
Right. Yeah, because they say really the Final Fantasy 10 series is at 20 million, right?
Yeah.
But then what does that mean the
HD remasters are always their sales are always as a collective, and that's sold 7 million collectively, which is obviously a huge number for an HD remaster. It has to be probably the best selling HD remaster ever from that generation of games.
Yeah.
I can't think of another PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 HD remaster that's done anywhere near that.
Yeah. And that was a highly sought after game. Because I kind of remember the first time I got my PS3, and I got one of the PS3s that wasn't backwards compatible, right? It was actually just after they stopped making the backwards compatible PS3s. And I was like, man, I wish I could play Final Fantasy X on this thing. It was my first thought. And I was so excited when they announced the HD remaster, and they showed off that they were, kind of improving the visuals and stuff. And I was really excited for it. And, there was a rumor a while back about Final Fantasy X getting a remake. I think that rumor is totally BS, but there is kind of a part of me that thinks that, business-wise, it's not a terrible idea.
Yeah,
it's totally not a terrible idea at all.
I've been saying for years that even if Square Enix made Final Fantasy X-0, right, and it was a prequel about Braska, Auron, and Jecht, and it was in the same visual style as the 10 HD remaster, that would sell in the millions.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be an expensive game to make theoretically.
Yeah.
Because they made 10-2 in a year and a half back then.
Yeah.
So they should be able to make a 10-0 of it doesn't have to be a big budget, massive mega remake 7 remake style. It just needs to be what the taste the HD remasters have sold 7 million copies, so that even if half of those people buy 10-0.
Yeah. I think 10 is probably the game that I'd put closest next to 7 in terms of impact and in terms of people really knowing it and people being really passionate about it. So I feel the fact that 10 didn't get milked as much as it potentially could have, because I feel like they could have put out a number of 10 spin-offs and sequels.
The crazy thing around 10 is that if you're looking at just not necessarily sales but profitability, 10 and 10-2 as a collective unit is basically the most profitable HD releases, not including the MMOs, but it's the most profitable set of games they've released ever. Really? I'm pretty sure. I know Final Fantasy X is the most profitable mainline entry offline, really? Even though it didn't sell as much as 7 because they sold it at a slightly higher price point. And then if you think about the HD remasters and everything, the HD remasters have sold more than the compilation of Final Fantasy 7.
Wow.
Wow. Crisis Core was 2 million, I think. Dirge of Cerberus managed to clear 1 million. Yeah. And Before Crisis did okay, but 10-2 sold 5 million on its own ish, right. 5.5 million. Sold as much as a mainline. Sold there's more than 9 and on par with 12. And So like, 10 as a collective like series is huge.
Right.
And like, the fact that the HD remasters have done so well just shows how much appetite there is for that. And yeah, like it's kind of, if you think about Square as like them as a money making entity, and sometimes we harp on them for going down that route a bit too much with their polymorphic content. Yay, Yuichi Wada. The fact that they didn't go after 10 more aggressively is kind of crazy, especially because every single time they mention 10.3, everyone just loses their mind.
Absolutely.
Like, and like as content creators as well, like most of us know that if you make videos about Final Fantasy X, they do well.
They do
even
really
now.
Well. They do really
after
well.
all this time. It's it's crazy that they keep teasing 10.3 and they're like, yeah, we'll do it after the 7 remake compilation series project thing's done. But like that's like ages away.
Yeah.
Like just make an interim game. Just do something.
It's yeah, man. It's insane because I mean, like you said, with content too. Like if something big with like Final Fantasy X happens like right now, like as a content creator, I can tell you it's a guaranteed almost 100,000 views, explosive viewership. The love for 10 has not diminished at all, and in fact, I think time has only done 10 favors. Because they've tried, right? Content, the wider media has tried its best to like just really harp on 10. Like the laughing scene, they tried to like really blow that up and make it a joke of a game. And like they've tried, and like in tier lists, 10 has periodically got lower and lower and lower as it's gone on. But as we were just saying with 15, it doesn't seem to affect sales whatsoever. Like it doesn't matter. Like you can have Final Fantasy 12 as your massive top tier, this is the best game ever made, but the Zodiac Age has sold like 1/7 of what the HD remasters have tended. That's insane. And especially too because as a remaster, the Zodiac Age is a better remaster, I feel like.
Yeah, they did a lot of stuff in that. A lot of positive stuff as well.
Yeah. That being said, I probably prefer 10 as a game. But like the actual work that was put into like making like the Zodiac Age like really shine, there's a lot more work being done there. And also, I mean, like the concept of the Zodiac Age, because obviously it's built on the International Zodiac Job System, like that is it's like a different game. Like the story is the same, but like not very much else is. Whereas the 10 HD remaster is basically just they made it look a bit nicer. North Americans got the content that they didn't have before that we did have, like the Dark Aeons and Penance and stuff. So for North Americans, it was great because they got to experience a lot of content they didn't have prior. But the Zodiac Age was like a completely redone version for the most extreme reasons as well. Like it, I can go down that rabbit hole if you want as to why it was that crazy. It's good. Honestly, the only I think about 10's remaster, and this is like resurfaced recently. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's like people are really upset about the faces, particularly
and every single
I kind of agree. Actually,
PS3 version had it, and then they changed it again for the PS4 version. And like they keep changing Titus's face.
They do.
They just
and
I don't know why.
They can't get it right. And they've made new CG models for Titus, and it's terrible. It's terrible. It never looks quite like the older CG models for him either. And
the Mobius version is probably like the worst as well.
It's really oh my god. Susie in chat saying Titus looks like mashed potatoes in the remaster. He kind of does. Like he had like a very nice
Unix
face.
pretty bad as well, though. It's just like they just I don't know what they did to them, but like it's been happening with a lot of the characters too, because Tifa has like her face has been changed quite a lot, and like there is the whole thing in Remake how they've basically made most female characters now just look like a Tifa reskin. Yeah, like they don't really look that different anymore.
Yeah, Elena. People were commenting on how they reused Tifa's face model for Elena, and it's pretty
Avalanche as well.
Yeah, it's a pretty obvious asset reuse. The girl in like the Yuffie DLC. Yeah, where it was also kind of like another reuse of her face model. I get it, like, because you want to get the most mileage that you can out of those very expensive to make current generation models. That they're super duper expensive to make, and so it is a common developer practice to take like your best face models and to put new textures on it, and you'd be really surprised, honestly, just how like a different eye color and some different eyebrows and a different hairstyle.
OG Final Fantasy VII with Cloud and Zack in itself, right?
Yeah, exactly, right.
Just change the hair a little bit, different character, all good.
Yeah, so it's not like it's a super uncommon practice, but I do think like it has kind of become obvious at some point that face model, like they really like it, and they're really determined to get like their usage out of it. Okay, so let's suppose then that you are working on like the next Final Fantasy VII Rebirth trailer, or better yet, let's suppose that you're working on like the marketing for FF7 Rebirth.
Don't do this to me.
Because you know this company well. What do you do? What do you do to make this be that next top selling Final Fantasy game in the way that Square Enix wants it to be, in the way they've been pursuing, in the way that like has been motivating all of their decisions really for like the past like maybe 15 years? This idea of making Final Fantasy this big AAA player. How do you bring those people in? Because like you said, it's more about marketing, right, than it is about even how good the game is necessarily.
Exactly, and I know Susie's in the chat, so she'll maybe agree with me on this. But like, if you look at the Callisto Protocol, right, they went super hardcore marketing. They sold so many copies because of that, and then afterwards, everyone realized, yeah, maybe this game isn't that good, but like they still sold like in the millions of copies with a new horror IP, where like horror games don't typically sell like that much. And like its sales were on par, I think, with the Dead Space remake, despite the quality not really matching up, just because they went so hard on the marketing, right? They managed they had stupid targets anyway of like 5 million copies they needed to sell, but even still, like if you get that aspect of it right, Barbie's perfect example at the moment, right? They did such a fantastic job with their marketing that it's blown the movie up, and you can just get it completely wrong. And so with Rebirth, I think if I was in charge, my main objective would be basically ignore the first game even existed. It doesn't matter. Like it's gone. That's done. Like I don't. And like if you think about the games that have been able to do that, like the Mass Effect and the Assassin's Creed, they don't make reference to what happened before. They don't care. Like Assassin's Creed 2, they were like, Ezio here, Altair, who the hell's that? We don't care. Like it was immediately, it's like, this is the new thing. This is why you need to care about it, and don't care about what happened before. And like, to your point, like, there are franchises where you go in midpoint, like I was thinking like a Dragon, Yakuza, right? Most people in the West didn't even have the chance to play beforehand. Final Fantasy VII, perfect example. I didn't even know the first 6 games existed. The fact it had a 7 on the side didn't matter to me. It was the fact that everyone is talking about this game, everyone's going crazy about it, I've got to play this. You can go back and look at the rest of it if you want to afterwards, but like ultimately they need to get people caring about why they should care about this game specifically. It's not about a saga or a franchise or whatever. It's just, why do you need to play Rebirth more than any other game on the market right now?
Right.
And like, if you think about that first trailer, it didn't do that, right? It was right. If you liked Remake, oh, here's a little bit of a tease for what's coming next, right, kind of thing.
It's exciting as a Final Fantasy VII fan.
Exactly.
If you're not,
but for everyone else, it was like,
right,
what? Why should I be interested in this? So that would be my thing. Like, just I don't know how they need to do it, but like I feel as though they need to just pretend Remake never existed, and just focus on the strengths of Rebirth and why Rebirth as a standalone, unique entry is everything it needs to be. And if you think about Kingdom Hearts 3, that's kind of what they did, right? There were elements of the past, but it was all about these new worlds. It was all focused on the Disney world. They, like, they talked about the fact you don't need to play the previous ones, but that's only because he kept getting asked those questions because of how ridiculous the story is. But Kingdom Hearts 3 has sold more than the previous ones. So, you know, Square Enix have shown they can do it with other franchises. Just like when it comes to Final Fantasy, I do feel as though there's barriers there because obviously, you know, you mentioned Dragon Quest, and it's kind of similar to Final Fantasy in that Dragon Quest 11 is not connected to 9, so they're not sequel. They're never direct sequels or anything, right? They're always kind of standalone new entries. Like there's connections, but they're not inherently like follow-ons like 10-2 was, for example, or Rebirth will be for a remake. But Square have never really been able to, with Final Fantasy, get more people interested in what comes next than they were in what came before for some reason.
Right. I think part of that too is that this is probably the first time in a Final Fantasy sequel that they've ever attempted to escalate the content, the amount of content and the spectacle and those sorts of things over the last one. I think that when you look at like 10-2 or 13-2 in particular, those games, the way they were marketed, the way they were presented, is that they kind of almost felt like, hey, yeah, this is like intentionally a step down from, you know, like clearly not as much money went into those sequels as the initial games, right? So yeah. Rebirth will be different in the fact that it's going to be like the first attempt to escalate from the first game, to make something that feels overall bigger, better, and more grandiose than the thing that came before it. And will that work for Rebirth? I don't know. But I think like the most important thing again is, like you said, kind of marketing it to people who really don't know what's going on. And that's kind of the thing too, right? Is that all these titles are kind of interconnected. And Zack is like the big mystery that's supposed to be the shakeup. But I also think too, for people who don't know anything about Final Fantasy VII, which is who we're trying to reach, right?
Yeah. Who's Zack? We don't know.
Yeah, like it was kind of like, and you know, for me and my experiences with talking to people who are playing FF7 for the first time through Remake, they were just like, I thought I understood everything until I got to the ending. And then I saw the black-haired guy, and I really didn't understand what was going on.
Yeah.
And that's usually what they tell me.
You know, amongst like the core fan base, you know, Zack's very popular, especially amongst people who have played Crisis Core.
Right.
But if you only played the original game and you didn't actually look at all of the optional cutscenes as well, like Zack's role was very minor. And like it's amazing how popular he's become despite essentially being a very minor character in that original game. But like outside of like, if you think about like I constantly think about Final Fantasy in relation to the wider video game sphere. Like Zack Fair is not like a popular character in the same way that Cloud and Sephiroth are. Like Zack Fair is not going to be put in Smash, for example. Like he's just not. He's not there in terms of that level of wider adoption. So like, if you're focusing on Rebirth, it's like Cloud is your main tool that you have to get people into this as a marketing thing, right? And the main protagonist is always super important in these games. And again, if you think about that initial Rebirth trailer, they didn't really show Cloud in that great a light in that trailer. Like he doesn't really do anything apart from like open a door.
Right. Yeah, so focusing kind of on Cloud because he's the one that the average Joe gamer doesn't probably know too.
Or if they're going to focus on Zack, right, they have to make Zack seem like this absolute powerhouse beast of a guy that you want to play as, even if you don't know who that is. Right.
So, because they have to, because that's the setup that they have. So, I think they can do that. I think they can show off a lot of Zack. I think they could probably market Zack really well, considering how big his popularity has been exploding, especially. I feel like there's definitely a path forward to being able to make him appeal to that broader audience who isn't familiar with his character. I think if there is any mistake that they've kind of made, it's just kind of like there has been a little bit of, and I think this mostly applies to the first game because I don't know how they're going to handle things with Rebirth, but I think there was maybe slightly a little bit of hubris with like the assumption that mainstream gamers would just automatically know stuff, right? Like, like everyone on Earth knows this approach, which I didn't really agree with that.
Yeah, I think I mean, that's the thing, right? When 7 Remake was announced as a project, it blew up. Right,
it was massive. It was insane.
It was massive. Like, you know, obviously trailers now have done more. There's more gamers. There's more people on YouTube and stuff. But when the 7 Remake trailer came out, that was by far the most viewed trailer in history from a video game perspective. Definitely for PlayStation, maybe not as a wider thing, but I'm pretty sure that, you know, it was up there as one of the most viewed and most games that people were most excited about. It was like top tier, and you know, it showed the value again of like a CG trailer, right? They didn't need to show anything else. It was literally just Cloud walking through a bar.
I still think that till this day,
and that was enough.
Yeah, the greatest video game teaser of all time.
But what they did after that was just classic Square, right? They did nothing for like 2 years. No, they showed the rebuilt state of play, which is kind of like haphazard, and then it went all quiet for a while. Then there was we're actually basically starting development again because we weren't happy with how it was going, and like the time between that initial reveal to the re-reveal where they had the state of play was like 3 or 4 years. And so the hype they had at that moment was just kind of gone. And then they were back to like it's a really probably bad comparison, but it was very similar to essentially what happened with Versus 13, right? You know, when they rebranded
at the time.
When they rebranded to 15, like Tabata knew that he had to go above and beyond to get people interested and re-engaged with this game, like beyond just the bare minimum. And with Remake, it's like, you know, they didn't start the marketing really until like 9 months before the game came out, 9-10 months before the game came out. And like they were at trade show stuff, but they didn't do anything beyond what anyone actually expected. Whereas with 15, they did so much. Like they did a full-scale movie, they did the animated series, like, you know, they had all these insane tie-ins. They had Sakaguchi like rolled out on a red carpet every 5 seconds to be like, you should play this game, guys. They had all the big music tie-ins. Like they just did everything they possibly could to get like anyone caring about that game. The trailers they produced were crazy. The collaborations, tie-ins with 7 Remake, as you said, like it felt like they just assumed it was going to do well.
Yeah,
like, and the marketing was just it was exactly what you'd expect to see. They didn't do anything outside. They could have done easily in the time that they had available. They could have made a Kingsglaive style movie as a promotional tool, as a precursor or something, right? They had like 3 or 4 years to figure it out. Like Advent Children was made in less time than that, and that was a huge tool for the compilation as a collective. They could have done an animated series like Brotherhood. Again, that didn't take too long to pull together. That series collectively, I think, has like almost 10 million views on YouTube across all the different parts. And like, you know, even Episode Arden, they did a precursor to that with Episode Arden Prologue as well. I probably did say FF7 Remake as well, yes. But like they could have done a lot more outside of what they actually did. But it feels like with the time they have left between Rebirth launching and now, I don't really feel as though there's time for any of that to happen again. Like, you know, the E3 Summer Games Fest period has gone. We had that kind of trailer that didn't really appeal to the wider masses. You've got Gamescom, which isn't traditionally known for like big trailer reveals. There's the rumored PlayStation event happening supposedly at the end of this month, but maybe a bit later in the year. Tokyo Game Show, again, not an event that's typically known for mass. They usually just put out a kind of a ticket over trailer, like, you know, here's a new piece of information, but nothing like world beating. They don't have much time left to like bring that. It's probably going to be something at the Game Awards, but that's like the last throw of the dice at that point.
Right.
So it's like I don't know. To your initial question, I don't really know where they go. It's difficult to see Rebirth getting where they want it to be. It could surprise us all, right? It could be amazing. It could sell 5 million copies day one. And obviously there's going to be so many comparisons with how it does in comparison to 16.
Right. That's going to be annoying too.
It's going to be a fun time.
That's going to be incredibly. I mean, just with discussing Final Fantasy 16 sales, that has been insanely annoying. We've had to deal with comparisons to Pikmin 4, as if that was like even possibly like a relevant comparison. I mean, like, if we're going to compare Final Fantasy 16 to Pikmin 4, then we need to compare every Sony IP to like Animal Crossing, which Animal Crossing like annihilates. Like,
Pokemon. Like,
yeah. It's like, I mean, I'm pretty sure, if I'm not mistaken, I want to say that like Animal Crossing, the latest one, came out like near like The Last of Us 2, and it blew The Last of Us 2 like out of the water. Does that like mean that like people they should stop making The Last of Us games? Like it's kind of extremely obtuse that
for some reason, and I don't quite know why, Final Fantasy 16 has basically just become this it's a thing that you can just beat.
Yeah.
and it's just like a free win at the moment. Like if anyone that can connect anything to Final Fantasy 16 and portray that game in a negative light, and it's just for some reason that's just the what everyone wants to do at the moment. They just want to beat it with whatever stick they can, and it doesn't matter where that stick comes from. Like they can make any kind of comparison whatsoever. It doesn't matter how nonsensical it is.
Yeah.
But everyone's like latching onto it, going, "Yeah, we told you 16 was a disaster and it didn't do very well or whatever." And it's just like, it doesn't. These things don't make sense half the time. Yeah,
a lot of times too. And that's not even to say that I don't have like criticism of the game, but I do whenever I look at a lot of gamer discourse, a lot of even like journalist discourse, like most surprisingly too, I find a lot of either the lowest hanging fruit or stuff that like shouldn't even be the thing that we're talking about if we're going to talk critically about the game. I mean, just like a lot of stuff, like people running articles about the game's too dark, and I don't mean visually. I mean just like there were those articles too, right? Yeah, there were those articles too. But yeah, they didn't like that the fact that the game was like a dark fantasy, and I'm like, that's not like what I would say is like really wrong with the game. I mean, that's a creative decision. I personally like that dark fantasy, but it's like trying to say that like it's wrong because it went with a very popular like fantasy genre, for example. I just feel like that's like a really obtuse argument, stuff like that people have tried to make. I feel as though part of the reason like 16 has just been unfortunate in many ways. Like if you think about previous games, so Final Fantasy 15, not the most critically acclaimed game, but fastest selling game in the franchise's history, 5 million copies day one, right? It dispelled all the myths, that it wasn't going to sell or whatever. So people like immediately kind of like had that like that criticism stuff taken away from them because everyone could counter with, but it's still the fastest selling game in the franchise's history, right? Final Fantasy 7 Remake came out, fastest selling PlayStation 4 exclusive, right? I believe, until it got beaten by another game which I can't remember, but I think it sold faster than Spider-Man and God of War. And so that was immediately that one, right? I remember Maximilian Dude that was his whole thing. It's the fastest selling PlayStation 4 exclusive, so therefore it's done incredibly well. But then obviously they had the 5 million sales by August, but at which point God of War and Spider-Man had like massively sold faster by in terms of like how long on the market. But that's a different conversation. Like by that point no one really cares that much about the comparisons because still it was the fastest selling PlayStation 4 exclusive at the time. So
again, they couldn't really do that. 16 hasn't had any milestone. It's not the fastest selling anything. Unfortunately, it's sold well. The only milestone it has is that in Japan, it's the best selling PlayStation 5 game they've ever released. Right? But that's the only milestone it really has, I think. Because I'm pretty sure like God of War Ragnarok has done way better than 16 has, and across the board. Horizon probably did better than 16 did across the board. And so like, you know, it's done well, but it doesn't have that like achievement that other games have had or have had associated to them.
Right. And this is also another thing too, is that when you look at it, Final Fantasy 16 selling 3 million on, you know, 38 million, now 40 million PS5s at the time, versus, you know, FF7R selling roughly the same at 3.5 million on 110 million PlayStation 4s. You know, it sold almost the same, despite less than half the installments.
7 Remake sold less on the PlayStation 4 at launch than 15 did, right? And no one really talked about that because, again, it was the fastest selling PlayStation 4 exclusive. Yeah, it's people pointing out that 16 is the fastest selling PlayStation 5 exclusive, but I don't think we have any actual confirmation on that, right? Because actually, I mean, God of War Ragnarok, I believe like 80% of the sales were on PlayStation 5 as opposed to 4. I don't know Horizon's ratio, but like, I'm pretty sure that if 16 was the fastest selling PlayStation 5 exclusive worldwide, they would be like shouting about that from the rafters.
Right. And you know, also the thing too is that the game has sold as much as RE4 Remake, which released on last gen and current gen. It sold the same amount in the same weekend. And
PC as well.
Week span, yeah. And no one said that game was a failure. No one said that Street Fighter was a failure either. Selling 2 million in the same span on multiple generations of consoles. So I do think that yeah,
it's that cherry picking, right? I've seen so many people, especially when the UK sales came out and the Japanese sales are also the same. These comparisons with Final Fantasy 7 Remake and 15 don't make sense because Final Fantasy 15 came out at a time when digital sales were very low priority, right? They just, people didn't buy digitally at that point. It was very, very small. And when 7 Remake came out, it was still very physical biased. There was an increase in the digital because of the distribution issues that happened because of COVID at that time. A lot of people were worried they weren't going to get it on release day, so they bought digital in addition to their physical. But still, the physical ratios were really, really high. And so, like, you know, when 16 came out, and I believe in the UK, it's only sold like 33,000 copies or something like that. And everyone was like, oh, well, you know, 15 sold like 120,000 and 7 Remakes sold like 90,000. So it sold so much less than those. And it's like, yeah, because that doesn't take into consideration any of the digital sales. And then we found out that, you know, actually only that 33,000 copies was only like 40% of the total sales. So therefore 16 sold around like 80,000 in that first week.
Yeah.
Well, then it's kind of on par with the 7 Remake and 15. And it's the same in Japan as well. They're looking at those like 400,000 copies, I think it's sold now in Japan. But that's physical copies, right? So if you're including the digital copies too, and there's a similar ratio, I mean, Capcom say that like 80% of their sales now are digital, right? Obviously that includes PC in that figure.
Right.
But even if in Japan it was a 50-50 split, it means that Final Fantasy 16 has sold 800,000 copies in Japan. And 7 Remake or 15 sold like 1.1 million in its lifetime. So again, it's not that far away. You're talking about like a couple of 100,000 copies from being in comparison to 15 and 7 Remake. I don't think sold 1 million copies physical. So again, like you're very close. If that is then a 60% split to physical and digital, Well, that means that 16 sold 1 million copies in Japan. So then it's completely slap bang in the middle of what Remake and 15 achieved. But because people don't have access to those numbers, it's all like, well, it's sold 400,000 physical, so that's all we can, and we know the 7 Remake physical, and we know the 15 physical. It doesn't matter about the fact that 15 came out like 7 years ago when the ecosystem was completely different.
Right.
Like the Japanese sales, like you have to compare like with like now. Like the complete landscape has changed. For like decades, it was physical only, but now we're in a very, very digital focused ecosystem, and buying behaviors have changed massively. Like Diablo 4 was, I think, like 81, or maybe even 90% digital copies. Like, you know, it's crazy. And like, I think the other thing that people also don't take into consideration too is that Final Fantasy 15, they did incredibly well at selling the deluxe version, more so than they did with 15, and more so than they did with 7 Remake. And I think in the UK, 25% of or in one of the regions, I think it was, 25% of the copies were deluxe edition, which had a 50% or almost 50% higher price point on it. So like, if you're thinking about profitability, well, it's done incredibly well. 15 also sold at a higher price point than Remake and 15. 16. Did I say 15 or 16? No. 16 sold at a higher price point than 15 and 7 Remake. So that in itself means that it's potentially done more as well. So there's all these different things to consider now. But yeah, as you said, like, people want to make these kind of like broad stroke comparisons without taking all these nuances into consideration. But ultimately, like, you know, we can sit here as fans and deliberate on this all day, every day, but we don't actually know. We don't know. We don't know how many copies Final Fantasy 16 has sold. All we know is sold more than 3 million. Well, as far as we're concerned, 7 Remakes only sold 5 million. Like, they've never announced anything further than that. We know it's sold more.
Right, clearly, yeah. It's definitely way beyond that, right? I imagine.
We don't know where.
Like, but we don't know exactly. And so we can only like really kind of talk on what we know, and it's also limited, right? So it really is hard to even say, like, but Square did, you know, come out and they issued a statement basically saying that actually, you know, it's doing pretty well, we think. So the fact that they had to, and some people said that was kind of like damage control. That's what they tried to argue, and I disagree, because one, I don't think Square has ever been afraid to say when a title's not meeting expectations. They're quite forward with it, and then also too, it would almost kind of be, I don't think they really could like try to artificially pump it up, because if they did, then it's like it could look really bad on them, basically. Exactly. Yeah.
And I guess the one thing that you need to take into consideration, that there is kind of, there is a degree of fact in this, is that Final Fantasy 16, I don't believe it has been discounted yet, right? It's still selling at full retail price.
Yeah.
And that is a sign that the game is selling, and selling as expected. Because if the game was not meeting what the retailers wanted it to do, they will be dropping that price so quickly. I mean, we've seen it with so many games. Like Forspoken, for example, was like 40-50% off within like a week or two, because they knew that they weren't going to sell the stock they had. Like, and there's some comments in there about like the 15 one being like, you know, sold to retailers, but they sold through those copies very, very quickly. If you look at the Final Fantasy 15 milestones of how quickly they hit 6 million and 7 million, 8 million, there wasn't much time between those. Like, but you know, Forspoken is a class, and there's so many examples recently in the last couple of years of games that have just come out at a high price point, and they just haven't sold. So the retailers are just desperate to make something back, that they're willing to cut their margin down to just get it out, just get it out. I mean, like 7 Remake, I think they had their first discount like 2 or 3 months after launch, I believe. They're like a third off, like they did that like big promo around it, and I'm sure they'll do the same with the 16. But you know, ultimately, if the retailers wanted to get their money back because they don't think the game is going to sell and they don't think they're going to get their stock out the door, they'll discount it. Like they will just do whatever they can to recoup their costs, because ultimately they made an investment in buying the stock, and it's sitting in their warehouse, not Square's warehouse.
Right, exactly. And so, and that makes perfect sense to me. I think 16's doing a lot better than people probably think it is. Again, I think people kind of equate their feelings on games to how they think that they are going to perform market-wise. And let me tell you something. If my feelings equated to how games equated performance-wise, we'd have an entirely different industry than the one that we have now. Sometimes
that's what you really think, Ryan. Come on.
Yeah. I can't ever say anything I really think. I can say some stuff, but I can't ever go fully off course, because then I'll destroy the entire industry, man. I'll expose everyone and everything. It'll be so crazy. The FBI, the Illuminati, they'll all come after me, man. But that does bring me into Final Fantasy 16. So last time we talked, you had got invited to play Final Fantasy 16 before it came out. Now Final Fantasy
became an internet celebrity overnight, right?
Yes. We had clips posted to Reddit and everything. Thank you everyone for sharing. That video did really well, so I appreciate it. But now we played the game, and there has been quite a bit of criticism around Final Fantasy 16. Now, particularly that criticism comes around a lot of the game's what many critics call the lackluster RPG elements. Do you agree with that sentiment, that the game felt like it was missing that RPG soul to it?
Kind of. But I do feel as though like the criticism is coming from an odd place, if that makes sense. Because it's like some of the mechanics that are in there, like the crafting system, I think everyone agrees is half baked. Like no one's gonna be going to bat to defend that crafting system. I don't think I've seen anyone do that.
Yeah.
But like what's weird is that the game is being criticized for what it's not, as opposed to for what it is, right? So people are complaining about what's not in the game and what they wanted to see in the game, as opposed to critiquing the game for what's actually there. And that's where like I feel as though it's a bit strange in a way. Like if there's mechanics in 16 and you're not happy about how they were implemented, well that's valid feedback, and you can provide constructive criticism around how they could potentially improve it and why you think it didn't work very well. But if you're just saying like, well, this game isn't very good because that's not there, well, that's a different kind of thing, right? You're basically you're not actually critiquing the property. You're critiquing something that you wanted it to be, which is based around it's like the thing of you're not critiquing you're more critiquing the expectation you had than the reality of what it actually is. So it's like when people are saying stuff about the role-playing mechanics, it's like it's the whole thing. It's not a Final Fantasy game. Well, it's as much of a Final Fantasy game as any other Final Fantasy game, and they chose to go in this direction, and it should be criticized or praised based on the content that is actually in the game, as opposed to what's not in the game. But this has been happening for years. I still remember when 13 came out and people were giving it negative scores because there weren't towns. It's like, well how it's like that doesn't like the towns wouldn't have made sense in the game. It's like, well, just because Final Fantasy 10 and 9 had towns in it doesn't mean that 13 has to have towns to make it a good game. But you can't say it's a bad game because it doesn't have towns. It's a bad game because the story doesn't necessarily gel that well, and like there's many other reasons why that game can be criticized. Not having towns is not really it shouldn't really be one of those,
right? Exactly. That's exactly how I feel too. Like for example, like for me, like a lot of my criticism from like the gameplay perspective comes from things that I would expect from an action game. or that the action game that 16 tries to be, and how I think it could be better in some aspects. For example, its difficulty, right? And how what they're trying to achieve. I think you kind of have to criticize what a game is trying to achieve, and not necessarily what you think that it should have tried to achieve. Hylian says something interesting here that I kind of want to touch on. I think you can both critique it on the basis of the series it's a part of and the work in isolation. It's silly to throw away context. The game exists within a series. Can't blame people for judging 16 with the reference of predecessors. Yes, and also
I agree with that.
Also,
but I think that's a different type of criticism, right?
Yes.
Again, that's based on that expectation. Like this game,
right?
Like, you know, anyone who's in the Final Fantasy fan base, I don't think there's anyone who likes every single game, right? They just aren't.
There are people that claim they do, but they're lying. No one sat there and played FF2 and was like, "Yeah, bro, they cooked with this one. This game is so great." Like, stop lying, bro. 12 doesn't vibe as well with me as like 10 and 7 do, right? But even Final Fantasy Peasant has a tier list, right? You know, it doesn't. Not every game is just one. I've seen some people make a tier list and then put like 1 through 16 in like their entire tier list, and I'm like, dude, you don't honestly feel that way. And if you do, it's kind of infuriating, because it's like there's no way you think FF3 and FF7 are like equals. It's like, you know,
I'm not going to sit here and say that 12 doesn't vibe for me because it doesn't have an ATB system, right?
Yeah.
Technically, that could be the reason why I don't like it. But it's more that the system that they put in place wasn't better than the system that they had previously, right? So I can look at the active dimension battle system, and maybe I don't like that so much as the active time battle system, but that's a critique of the active dimension battle system as opposed to me just hoping that they'd put in the active time battle system again. You know, like, and with 16, it's like, yeah, there probably are things that I wished were in there. Like, you know, I think the 7 remake combat was amazing, and you know, I think it's a shame that they didn't build on that in some way, shape, or form with what they did with 16, right? But like, that's not a necessary reason why I wouldn't like 16. It's like a different type of criticism, and I saw a lot of critics being like, the game's amazing in all these areas, but this is missing. Not this was bad, this was missing.
Right. And so I think that obviously there is criticism of a game and a work and what that work is trying to achieve, and then there is criticism of it from the perspective of a franchise and where that franchise should go. And I feel like they're both valid forms of criticism. However, I feel like the criticism of a game in particular, like professional reviews, shouldn't come at it from like a franchise expectation criticism, right? Because that's not actually saying much about the game. And the reason I believe that, in part, is because, you know, the game itself may resonate with people in that sense if it achieves what it sets out to do, right? Even if that's not necessarily what you believe the franchise should go, right? So it kind of misses kind of the importance of letting a game achieve what it sets out to do, and how well does it do that versus what a franchise expectation is, right? And I also think that a lot of times franchise expectations can end up shackling a lot of series. And I also feel like, too, when you unshackle from a lot of those franchise expectations, you sometimes catapult those games into the stratosphere. That's something that was really, really big with Resident Evil 4, right? Because it did slightly pivot away from survival horror and became a lot more of an action game. But that was when RE4 achieved levels of success that previous Resident Evil games never.
And 7, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
7 was so different from 6 in so many different ways, but it's just the changes were positive.
Yeah.
Like, I think, again, it's those different types of criticisms, right? You know, as a fan, if you're a fan of turn-based combat and you go into 16 and you're like, I don't like this or whatever, that's fine. But the criticism shouldn't be it's not turn-based. It's that the criticism is based on the system that 16 adopts and why it doesn't. Right. It wasn't good enough to kind of like convince you that this change was a necessary change.
Right.
But like, if as you said, if you're doing like a professional critique, you should be looking at this action-based combat system and talking about why it's good or bad. It shouldn't be, well, I don't like this game because it's not turn-based. Which is, and if you're a fan, I feel as though that's the kind of criticism that is then valid, right? Because it's more of an emotional criticism as opposed to a mechanical and like a criticism in that regard, like breaking the game down to its different components and talking about what does and doesn't work and why it doesn't work.
Right.
Like when emotion, passion come into it, then it's a very different type of criticism.
Right. And that's how I feel about 16. Like, if I was, like, my criticisms that I have of 16 have more to do with the type of game that 16 is. Again, the difficulty, which I feel like it was somewhat of a mistake for them to not factor in how popular that the Soulsborne games were, and how popular things like Elden Ring are, and how many people are really seeking a challenge in these action games, and how they really didn't have that challenge there. And I feel like, honestly, you could have kept most things probably about 16 the same, but if you would have created a sense of challenge that was deeper with Final Fantasy 16, I think that it probably would have resonated a lot harder with a lot of action game fans in a way that it didn't, because I know a lot of people making guides and stuff right now, and a lot of their guides aren't getting nearly the viewership that they usually would.
The irony is that because it has those role-playing game elements in there, right, that's what caused that to happen, right? Towards the start of the game, it's actually reasonably challenging, right? The fight against Benedicta is probably one of the most challenging boss fights. Like, that's one I probably struggled with. It was one I got closest to having a game over with. But the more side quests you do and the better equipment you get, you get to the point where the game it's not really that difficult anymore. Just because you're so overpowered. But if you think about a traditional Final Fantasy game, if you're playing Final Fantasy 7 and you've got Knights of the Round and you've got Ultimate Weapon, you've got Omnislash, you walk up to Sephiroth, you're pacing him in a couple of turns, right? That's a role-playing game. You grind, you do all this stuff. But when you're in an action-based environment, the same sentiment doesn't really work that well. It doesn't have that same kind of power, right? Because people still want the challenge. They still want things to be like tailored a bit more to how well they're doing. And like, if we're talking about those criticisms, the fact that the hunts didn't get any harder, right? You kind of like, Svarog is like the level 51, and then the ones after that are a lower level, despite the fact that you're getting more powerful and much better. The hunts get easier. Like, it's those but then that's like where I feel as though the criticism is valid, right? That's constructive criticism, because if you're talking about the challenge the game offered, sure, they tried to make it appealing to a wider audience. But so many people did all the side quests and they did all the stuff, so they got way overpowered and the game became too easy, and people didn't necessarily want that. And then the checkpointing system kind of compounded that, because it's like, even if you didn't succeed, well, you're gonna do it next time round, without any problem at all.
A decent portion through the game, I realized that it made no sense to buy potions. Just die.
Just die.
Just die. And you got them all back, which effectively at that point Gil was useless, right? Like Gil is basically meaningless at that point, especially if you did all the side quests. Gil meant nothing, so there was nothing. And I point this out in my review, but I said that it kind of reminded me of like the older Zelda games where you'd get like a ton of rupees, and then you'd be like, "What am I gonna buy?" It'd be like nothing. Like because you could buy arrows or bombs, but you could just find arrows and bombs. So there was nothing to actually spend the money on. It just kind of accumulated, but there was nothing actually there. And yeah, the orchestration roles, right? Because they required a ridiculous amount of gil. And the reason they did, it was pretty obvious to me, was that they needed gil to have some kind of purpose, right? Because otherwise it didn't have any purpose. And so they came up with that. I think it would have been, or how should I say? I do think that the RPG elements in the game are worth criticizing, but I would criticize it in the fact that the RPG elements that exist there are not fleshed out enough to really deeply matter and to really give the player a sense of meaningful choice. And then from the action game side, as well as the RPG side, I'd also say that the actual abilities, to
me, weirdly, everything revolves around the crafting system. Because if you fix the crafting system, you fix a lot of the other areas that people are complaining about. Because so let's say you had a system where you could infuse weapons in the same way that the accessories work. So you could have your weapon reduce cooldowns for certain items or certain abilities, or you could make them stronger or something like that. And you could do the same thing for the belt that you can wear. Then that adds an extra dimension to things, right? And then that will require more crafting materials. So therefore, the side quests can actually have more value to them. You've got more things to spend your money on. You've got a reason to do hunts because you need to get more items as well. That would have made sense to me.
Yeah.
But they didn't implement that system, even though they could have easily done so.
Right.
Because the accessories already have those things there that you can enhance your gameplay, and you'd also be able to create more tailored gameplay styles, right? At the moment, you had 3 accessories that you could use to try and focus more on one particular icon skill set. But when you're at the end of the game, a lot of people didn't even use those because you'd be using the Genji glove. There's the kind of more damage boosting ones. It was kind of odd that the crafting system was so basic, because you'd craft a weapon, it would be replaced in 5 seconds by the next one. There was the iconic weapon. I didn't even craft that because I was convinced that I was going to need those materials at some point for something really cool. Yeah, and then it was never there.
I resented getting stronger in the game, which I think you really have a deep problem with game mechanics when you resent being stronger. I did the quest because I was doing all the side quests, and I kind of resented that there was the quest that increased your inventory and allowed you to get more potions. I was like, no, I don't want more potions. I was like, now the game's even easier. Great. Now I'm just going to be able to cheese all of this. And I don't think I'm the greatest guy at action games ever, but even I was just clapping bosses. And I think, there were a couple bosses that made me sit upright and that came toward the end, but for the most part, the ease. And I do agree with the crafting system too. It's why, and I'm just going to say it because I think everyone for the most part agrees, maybe not everyone. I just don't think that they've ever topped the materia system. I don't think anything has ever really... I think the sphere grid came really close and was also an excellent system in its own right. But the materia system was phenomenal, not just in the way that it interacts in battles, and not even just in the way that planning your build up, right? You also wanted to explore, because there might be new materia over there. Let me go check around the corner. So you'd go and explore every inch of the world because you didn't want to miss new materia. You'd check every shop because every shop might have a different piece of materia that you don't have, or you get another piece of very rare materia. You might get summoned materia. And so you'd unlock all these different abilities and stuff. It's just, materia probably was the best progression system that they've ever come up with. And I think there actually probably should be some serious discussion on to like what degree, and I don't think they need to like copy and paste the materia system as it exists in 7 to every game, but I think that there might be some discussion to be had about whether something at least like materia or something derivative of materia should just be used again, because it's such a good driving force for a game's progression systems.
I mean, it's kind of similar to the license board, right? Because it enabled, I mean, like 10 is also kind of similar, but it started off more contained in that you can make every character any character, right? You can switch things out. Like 7 and 10, ultimately the only thing that's unique is the limit breaks, right? Everything else, like they can all do the same things as everyone else. And like obviously 12, it's exactly the same, right? But they didn't even have the limit breaks that were unique to your characters there. It was just which quickening you learned, but everyone could learn any other quickening. But I think like the weird thing about it is, and it is probably because it was an action-based game, and like 7 Remake like towed the line, I think, in terms of like the difficulty, is that the previous Final Fantasy games aren't really hard, right?
Yeah.
You know, you go through 7, it's not really a difficult game. You can make it more difficult by just choosing to not grind ever and skip all random battles. But like they're not hard games. Like 13 was probably one of the more challenging ones because they locked the Crystarium level, so you couldn't get more overpowered. But when you're playing an action game, like when you're doing that kind of thing, like in 16 you got overpowered without really trying to, and I think that was kind of the mistake that the system had in that regard, because the game just became easy and without even really knowing why it was, if that makes sense. And like it didn't really feel that satisfying for the most part, but then it's a very hard balancing act.
Yeah.
And like, you know, 7 Remake really came alive in hard mode. Like before that, like the normal mode wasn't that difficult. Hell House was probably the most challenging one for me because I just didn't understand the mechanics initially. But like, yeah, I think it had like there was enough around it. But then, like, yeah, difficulty aside, 16's combat system, the reason why I don't really have too many criticisms around it is because it's just really fun, right? You know, really doing like figuring out the icon combinations and getting like a set that's really that's unique to you, and like doing like getting maximum stagger combos and stuff. It's just really fun, and like so I wasn't really too bothered about the difficulty that much because it was enjoyable to play.
Yeah, it was. And every time I had a battle that was semi-challenging too, and I was like really like, you know, shuffling around my abilities and figuring out what to use on an enemy, that's when I really enjoyed it the most. And there was part of me that was constantly seeing too, like, man, if only this game was just a little bit more challenging, a lot more challenging, then it would have like this huge depth, like a depth that I already see in that game. Because I already think it has like a crazy amount of depth to its battle system, but it's also like I just want to be able to use the depth that I know is there, right? Like a good example.
You tried Ultimaniac?
I have not tried Ultimaniac yet. I kind of got burnt out after my first playthrough because I played for like 70 hours in the first playthrough, and then after that I was like, I need to go play something short. And Ultimaniac sorts people out. Like, you know, I walked through the game without any trouble really whatsoever, and I was doing Final Fantasy mode without really too much trouble either. Like, it didn't really push me in the way that 7 Remakes hard mode did to like really learn the mechanics and understand the characters a lot better. But then I tried an arcade mode Ultimaniac for the Greatwood, and I couldn't even get past the first area. Wow, that's great. That's like, great. But see, the thing that I hate about that though is that it's like you have to play through the game twice, right? And then
only once.
No, but you have to unlock, because you can't do like Ultimaniac challenges you haven't encountered in Final Fantasy mode, right?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. So you got to play through the full game twice to get all the Ultimaniacs. Yeah.
Right. So yeah. So on the third time you play through the whole game, you can finally have the challenge that you're wanting. that's where it becomes like a kind of a problem for me. Is that the third time, bro, it'll it'll finally get there, like in terms of difficulty. I think that is like where a lot of the frustration of people comes. And then even then with Ultimaniac, it's not like a whole playthrough of the game that you're doing. You're just going through like on those challenges, right? So I feel like there is a great need for Final Fantasy mode to have been there on day one and not have been like a second playthrough thing. I think
Final Fantasy mode should have been like there accessible at the start, and then Ultimaniac should have been the one you unlocked once you beat the game. Mm-hmm. It's kind of similar to like it's probably a bad comparison, but Uncharted. Right? When you do a fresh run of Uncharted, you can do hard mode if you want to, and then when you finish that, you get crushing mode, which is like, you know, a real step up for the people that just really want to punish themselves. But you know, if you want that extra challenge off the bat, then you've got that available to you. Whereas, you know, with this one, it was like the normal mode. Anyone who's like remotely competent in action games is not really going to have any kind of challenge with this. And I think obviously one of the things that then becomes a bad comparison is everyone was talking about Devil May Cry 5, right? And so but then it comes down to, but it's still a fun game, right? So yeah, maybe the challenge isn't there, but you can still have tons of fun playing the game and just pasting people.
Yeah. So I wanna ask you then, since there was quite a lot that you enjoyed about this game, what do you think that Square Enix should take from Final Fantasy 16 and utilize going forward, and what do you think they should leave behind?
I think the story was one of the best stories we'd had for a long time, and the story is the aspect of a Final Fantasy game that trumps everything else. Like, I don't really care too much about the gameplay or the graphics or anything like that, as long as the story is there and it's got characters that you want to root for and get emotionally invested in. That's ultimately kind of like what, for this kind of game, that's what will make me remember it. And I think that 16 delivered on that front more than we'd had for a while. You know, I after finishing the game was an emotional wreck for a period, and I hadn't felt that way since playing 10. You know, it'd been kind of that long that the Final Fantasy game had got me so invested in what it was. The gameplay and everything else is just like it's a means to an end to me. Like, if it's great, it's great. But like, Final Fantasy's had so many different gameplay systems over the years. You know, even the first ones were turn-based, and you had active turn-based. 10 switched up to be a conditional turn-based system. You know, you even had 12, which was like, you know, pseudo real-time. 13 was again kind of pseudo real-time as well. Like, 15 was obviously like full-on, well, again, kind of pseudo real-time, but much more real-time than the previous ones. But if they had like strong stories in the way that 16 did, then I probably would have had a more positive view of those previous games. So like, I'm glad that the story was kind of front and center, and there was a lot of substance there. We had a lot of characters that we could really get behind. Like, I posted up the video about Dion because I really enjoyed Dion's character, and then it was more like, because I said that Dion was one of my favorite NPCs, and people were like,
same,
I preferred Byron, or I preferred, like, the fact that it wasn't a case of like, no, you're wrong. It was you're wrong because I preferred this guy, or this girl. Like, you know, that it was that's the sign of a good story. It's like, you know, you can have disagreements about which character you like more.
It would be a bigger problem if everyone said the same character, because it was unanimous in a way that like everyone felt kind of bored with everything else. Right? But exactly. It kind of was like everyone felt like a different character was like kind of special to them. That being said, I completely agree. I loved Dion. Favorite character by far. He clears. He was amazing. In terms of like what I would say keep and don't keep, first of all, keep the M rating. going forward. I think when it comes to striking the right tone for telling these types of stories, I feel like 16 got the tone really right. And everyone else in chat keeps saying active time lore. I've seen active time lore pop up so many times. And like, yeah, I agree. Keep active time lore for sure. I also really enjoyed the story. I do have some problems with some of the stuff in the story and some of the pacing around the story, but I actually feel like the emotion was there for sure. And I feel like it was still told in such a way that by the end, I still love the characters. And I had an attachment to Valistia. In terms of combat, there are some aspects of it that I really like. Like, I love just being able to go. This game calls it Stomp. Devil May Cry calls it like jump canceling. I love being able to, just jump all over an enemy and do stuff. In fact, what I really want to do, man, is I want to be able to, or enemy step, sorry. My bad, yeah. I really want to be able to enemy step all over a giant, boss and, be able to, pop out, my command window and, be able to do, Final Fantasy VII Remake style, I'm gonna do this, right? In the middle of being able to do an aerial combo, I can pause time and heal a party member, or use I don't know, bio or something.
I mean, I'm kind of surprised they didn't do that, because it was one of the things that the previous two games had done that was really smart, because both 15 and 7 Remake have an active mode, right? And so 15 it was wait mode, and in 7 Remake you had the slowdown time essentially when you're making a decision. I'm surprised they didn't put something like that in 16, because it would have kind of appeased the turn-based people. Or 7 Remake, they even put in the passive mode where the game kind of plays itself, and you can make commands and you can change that. They could have done something similar where you choose Clive's how aggressive he is, or which iconic set you want him to focus more on the others.
Yeah,
I think. So yeah, I like the combat system. I think it was really fun. It was very different from 7 Remake. I don't think it's necessarily one's better than the other. It's just they weren't really comparable.
Yeah, they're not.
And I'd said before, I think on here with you, that my wish was kind of that they had just taken the 7 Remake combat system, and Ryota Suzuki and his team had done their own spin on that.
Yeah,
which is how it was in the olden days, right?
Yeah.
It's how it was in the olden days. Each time Ito would work with his team of designers to be like, okay, so this was the battle system we had in 4. What can we change in 5? What can we change for 6? What can we change for 7? And they keep building and experimenting and trying these different things. Even tactics is has its core in those kind of systems, right?
Yeah.
Whereas they just were like, no, we're just ripping it up and doing our own thing completely.
Right.
All over again.
Yeah. If I was to compare Final Fantasy 1 through 10, it was sort of this is going to be a crazy comparison, but bear with me. Let's suppose you're making a burger, right? And every time it's we're going to try and make an even crazier burger than we made last time. And so every time you're like, dude, how are they going to make this burger work? But every time they would make the burger work. And now it's they serve a completely different meal every single time. So it kind of doesn't have the novelty of I've never seen a burger with I don't know what hasn't been on a burger before. I'm pretty sure they put everything on one. But anyway, it's there's no longer that novelty of oh, I've never seen anyone put this on here before to do that, right? It's just every time is a completely brand new thing. And then also too, how is it that you can ever refine anything when you never even use the same thing twice, right? And I have a video coming about this, by the way, you guys. But it's
spoilers.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of spoilers for the video, but it's kind of like, how do you make a better thing when you never make a thing twice? You never iterate on it, you never improve upon it. And that's something that FF1 through 10 did pretty well, right? Because almost all those concepts are things that they iterated on in the past, and then they'd also introduce something new on top of it. And I think why people long for like the turn-based games is not because they were actually turn-based, but because they had a consistent Final Fantasy identity to them. And it was always cool to see how far they could push that identity and keep something Final Fantasy, right? Now, that's not to say that they need to go back to turn-based, and that's not to say that that they need to do this or that, but it's to say that, like, okay, you made Final Fantasy VII Remakes combat, stick with it. Say that this is the style of combat. This is the new style of Final Fantasy combat.
Yeah,
this is what we're doing.
Final Fantasy combat.
Yeah,
it's
and we're
like that identity.
Right, and we're going to keep doing that, and we're going to keep making this better, and we're going to keep putting new spins on it. But this is the new Final Fantasy, right? I'll give you a perfect example of a game that's done this recently. Hylian's going to love me using this example, of course. But Zelda, right? They reinvented Zelda with Breath of the Wild, right? And then from then on, they have said Breath of the Wild is the new style of Zelda game. This is the style that we're moving forward with, right? And they did that again previously with Ocarina of Time. They said Ocarina of Time is the new style of Zelda game. And all the Zelda games after that were in the style of Ocarina of Time. The problem that I see with Final Fantasy right now is that each game is trying to be a complete reinvention of Final Fantasy. And at this point, I don't even care what they pick. They could pick 16 or 7R or 13 or like 15's open world style or something. Pick an identity and stick with it for a while, like you used to, and keep building on that. Keep saying, hey, this is our new... I do believe in a franchise has to reset after a while. Just to keep interest, to grow. I think that's great, right? And again, I think Zelda is probably like the greatest example of doing that successfully and making it even better and appeal to a bigger audience, while making a fundamentally more engaging game. Because
that's why the 7 Remake is so crazy, right? Because that game, the combat system was near universally praised. Right. And like, so development, I think the real challenge they had with those two games is that because they like went back to square one with 7 Remake like 2017, 2018, it's probably around the same time that they were developing the combat. So those two systems were being developed like side by side. So it's not like, even though 16 has come out 3 years after, it's not like that one came before the other as such. Right. But they could have changed 16's combat system to accommodate for 7 Remake or learnt from it. It's that I would love it to be that consistent theme. Because like even like 10-2, like the one that is generally like kind of the paragon of like ATB, that was a combination of like what they did in 10 and 9. Like they kind of like fused those two systems together to make this system that was like super active, but also very collaborative at the same time between the characters. Because you had the job chain system, which was basically like the character switching and like obviously it was active, but it was very fast as well. But then like from that point on, like every single game had a different combat director who had a different vision, and there was no like Ito was obviously the combat guy for years. From like he even helped to develop the combat of Final Fantasy 1, but it wasn't until 4 he became like the top dog. But from that point on, it's like if you did a Final Fantasy based combat system, he was involved. Like it was every single game had to have his kind of seal of approval on it, because he didn't work on 8, for example, because he was doing tactics. No, he didn't work on 7 or 8, one of the two. I think it was 7 actually, because he was doing tactics. But like there were enough people that knew his like working way that they were like, let's just make the game that Ito would have made. We'll put a couple of flourishes on it, but it was mostly just that consistent thing. But yeah, like 10 was really where things started to change, because it wasn't a system that Ito worked on because he was doing 9. They had Tsuchida work on it, who'd come from Front Mission, and like he was like really torn on what to do. Like they were going to do like an open world game, whereas like everything was in the field. That didn't work because of the scope of it. They just had to scale things back, and then it was like the conditional turn-based battle system was kind of like the last resort of like, we're running out of time here, we need to come up with something. And the exact same thing happened with 13 as well. Like the battle system wasn't really finalized until like I think 9 months until the game came out.
Yeah.
Like it was like a complete last minute thing. Like the when they did the announcement trailer at E3 2006, they didn't even have a combat system. Like what was shown in that trailer was just completely like made up.
Yeah.
Like and then they were like, how can we actually make that a reality? Like how does this work?
Yeah.
Like how can you function that way? It's mental when you think about it.
Yeah. I feel like especially too, if 13's combat had like a little bit more time to cook, it could have been probably one of the better FF battle systems overall. I don't think it's bad either though, by the way. I think it's actually quite a decent battle system, but I feel like if it did have like a little bit more time in the oven, it probably would have been even better than it was.
Yeah, 7 Remake was just like that perfect blend, I think, of that action they wanted to go for, but also pulling through like a modernized ATB system. Because it was that even though that combat is completely real time, it's still turn based at the same time.
Yeah. I think, and this is something I want to touch on from the Hylian. He says, I should reiterate, by the way, that Breath of the Wild is a reinvention, but always using tools that were already familiar. It's a mix of Ocarina of Time and Zelda 1's design philosophy. It's still an iteration on top of the previous design, much in the same way ATB was an evolution of the classic turn-based design between 3 and 4. Right. And I also feel like, too, that part of what has made Final Fantasy VII Remake a lot more of a well-received title when compared to 16's combat, which had a lot more criticism of it. I think that FF7R has had to approach from the fact that we have to bring all the Final Fantasy stuff that exists into this because it's a remake, right? We cannot omit Final Fantasy like stuff that was in the original game, and because of that, we have to figure out a way to make it all work. And I think that is why you don't have any of the complaints about things being like, oh, that's not there, right? And if it's not there, then the expectation is that it'll be in Rebirth or in the next game, right? Unfortunately, the number of titles don't really have the privilege of being able to have a next title in the same sense that the Remake trilogy is going to have. So they are all going to have all of those things on day one.
But it should do, right? Because that's how it used to be.
Right? Yeah, that is how it used to be. So
it's how it used to be.
Right.
And like we've been saying this since 15, right? Even though 15 didn't have the world's best combat, we were saying at the time, whatever you do next, build upon that. Like if this is the combat system you've chosen to go with, stick with it, right? Or if you do something else, it has to be better. Now obviously with the 7 Remake, what they created was better, but now with 16 they threw the dice again. They chose not to iterate, so what they come up with has to be better.
Right.
And they took a huge risk because ultimately they said in development that they didn't really care about us, right? They didn't care about the turn-based fans. Like they were hedging their bets on the action community. And I don't really know how well it's been received in those circles because obviously we're in our own echo chamber, right? So we hear massively amplified views of the existing Final Fantasy fans and people that like RPGs.
Yeah,
I don't really know how well it's been received in the wider action-based circles. People that don't care about RPGs at all, they want that kind of core gameplay. I've seen people having a ton of fun with it, doing tons of combos and just having a blast with it, but I don't really know how well it's being kind of viewed as a wider point. Obviously, then that should theoretically determine what happens next. Yeah, right?
With action game fans, it's really been about the difficulty quite a lot because for a lot of them, they just feel like, man, this is just way too easy. Which again, the action game fan in me has also been like, yeah, Like, I can see what's here. I can see what you're trying to do here, and I just feel like if there was just some layer of like, you have to like master this or you cannot
like Atlas,
continue.
right?
Yeah.
They showed off that demo at the event. It was a challenge, right? If the hunts were all like that, people would have been happy.
Yeah,
right?
people would
And
have
if
been really
bosses
happy
were
with
like
it,
that, they would have been happy.
Yeah,
But they're not.
yeah. So that's been like the disparity for action game fans. The good news is that to some degree that's patchable. That's something that DLC can kind of work on to some degree. So I feel like it's not a completely like hope lost sort of thing, especially in terms of long-term sales, which it's so crazy that, you know, we all focus on first week sales so much in this industry when like first week sales don't really say that much at all compared to like when you really look at like the big sellers. It's all about the legs. It's all about the legs and how those games continue to sell, right? Like as fast as like Final Fantasy 15 sold, it was really about the fact that it continued to sell 5 million units after that, right? It's really easy to have like these bombastic launches where you sell, you know, the fastest number of units ever and all this other stuff. What's even more difficult than that, and what's even more valuable than that, is having legs. Because you look at God of War, you look at Horizon, like they don't have.
I mean,
like,
Horizon 2, they didn't even announce sales figures.
Yeah.
Right. As far as everyone was concerned, it bombed, and then a year later, they're like, "Yeah, it's actually sold 9 million copies."
Yeah, and you know what? I mean, the first Horizon game, it sold 2.7 million. Yeah, 2.7 million on like its first week, right? Which is lower than FF16, and then 20 million units later on, right? And so
Spider-Man is on like 30-40 million now, and that sold worse than 7 Remake.
Yeah. So it's so funny. It's so funny, you know, when people, they harp on like these week one sales and they're like, this is what, you know, kind of determines the game's fate, when it totally doesn't. And most of these big Sony IPs that have sold, you know, in the tens of millions probably sell less than FF16 has, or about the same on its first week. Baby Seal is saying, I feel like we are kind of missing it here. We want FF to be good. The identity crisis isn't about one thing. It's that the games aren't good, bottom line. The reason 16's combat didn't hit was not comparatively. It absolutely fumbled in its own identity, not FF's. Had the combat been better and more thoroughly tested, we would not even be having this conversation. The caveat with starting fresh is quality. The only identity we really want from Final Fantasy is good. Dang, Baby Seal.
But it's true though, right? You know, as long as what comes after is better than what came before, that's the new identity. Yeah. Right. And like, because Final Fantasy VII was there were obviously like, you know, clear things that it continued from the previous games, but it was also so different in many ways, and it brought in a whole new fan base that just dwarfed the existing fan base. Right. Final Fantasy VII fan base became the Final Fantasy VII fan base essentially. Yeah. Right. Because that game had sold more collectively than all the previous ones. Yeah. And it's the same as happened to Zelda right now, right? Or it's the same with the Souls franchise. Like Elden Ring's sales have eclipsed the Dark Souls franchise. Yeah. Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild sales have eclipsed like the previous Zelda combined sales. Yeah. Like it's crazy. And like The Witcher 3 happened as well. Like occasionally you just get these games that just come in and they just create an entirely new fan base and an identity, but then it's what the company does from that point forward. Unfortunately for us, like we haven't really in the Final Fantasy franchise had that happen since 7. Yeah. Yeah. And again, each game's sales have kind of gone periodically down, apart from 15. Right. 15's the only one where it's brought in a decent chunk of people, but like those fans are generally quite quiet.
The director of Final Fantasy 15, what has he been working on, Darryl? Can you tell me?
So he's been on a bit of a roller coaster. I think that I mean I've always felt a bit not necessarily sorry for Tabata, but I think he does get a raw deal Like people are very critical of kind of what he did because of 15, because it didn't pan out again quite how they wanted. But ultimately, you know, the guy did manage to turn a game around that was in a disastrous state. He managed to get it shipped out. It's become the best-selling game that they've released for a long time. And I don't think he gets all that much credit for achieving that. And also, like, he made an incredibly passionate fan base to the point where they wanted a second season pass and they were going to make it. Because they felt there were enough sales there to warrant having that.
Yeah.
And yeah,
I'll never forget like how destroyed I was. Like when they when they had like the anniversary stream and they were like, I was like, it's been so long since we heard anything. I'm like, I'm so excited. They're going to talk about the FF15 season 2.
Nope.
And they're like, we've canceled it. I was like, oh man. Go on though.
But no, so obviously he left Square. They basically threw him under the bus. If anyone remembers that, they were like, we had to write off like £40 million worth of dollars worth of development work. And it's like, well, that's because you chose to cancel the work that they were doing, not necessarily anything that he did, which was, yeah, very creative press release wording. And then, yeah, so he founded his own studio called JP Games. And the first game they worked on was a game, the official game for the Paralympics, because he wanted to do a game that was, I don't want to say like philanthropic, but like he wanted to do a game that was very unorthodox, right? So he wanted a game that was all about showing people with disabilities and showing that they could compete and do all these different things. And it was like, from a gaming perspective, it was, I believe, it was one of like the biggest spotlights that the Paralympics had ever had, right? It's not something that typically gets like a ton of traction in those kind of worlds, but he wanted to do that. And the game like launched. It did reasonably well from what I understand. They had in Japan. They had huge collaboration events. I think the Pineapple Pen guy did a live concert in game. They also had some like big bands do some stuff in there. And then yeah, like they used that to do some other stuff. Like the one thing that I would say about Tabata, genius businessman. Like not everything he does works, but like he knows how to make money.
yeah,
he knows how to make money.
Yeah, no question.
And like, you know, I remember when I was writing the book, and if you read the passage about Final Fantasy 15 and Dan Sito, who worked on it, he wrote a lot about it because he worked at Square during Tabata's tenure, and you know, someone saying in the chat he's a real hit and miss. It's like, yeah, because he was willing to take risks, right? If team members came to him with ideas, he was like, yeah, give it a go, like roll with it, see what you can do, kind of thing. And like some of those turned out to be good, some of them turned out to be not so good, right? Brotherhood was an idea from the marketing manager. He was just like, we should do an animated series, and Tabata was like, yeah, and you're going to direct it, you know. You know, like that's crazy. And that's kind of how they worked with it. Like he empowered his staff members to come up with these projects, to do these things and see them through, because he knew that's how they would learn. And you know, we see they've actually announced a lot of the people that have moved over to JP Games now, and a fair few of them were senior figures from Business Division 2 or Luminous Productions that left to go and join his new company. Like if they thought he was a useless developer or a really bad director, they probably wouldn't have done that, because that's their careers. Like it's you wouldn't do that unless you believed in kind of the trajectory. So a while ago he did one of those, you know, like they do their development interviews in Japan, where they talk to like, here's 100 developers and what are your aspirations for the next year, and Kataze usually says like code name 7. It's going to be 7 announcements that you've got to look forward to. Tabata did one where he said that they were working on 2 games. One was a spiritual successor to 15, and one was a spiritual successor to Type 0, and they were basically going to be the games that he wanted to make but couldn't. and we haven't heard anything for ages. So he's just started talking a bit more now in the last couple of months, and he did an interview with 4Gamer, and he's talked about how basically COVID. It seems like COVID has like put paid to some of those plans. They've kind of been put on hold, shelved, or like maybe the publisher that they had lined up to fund these AAA games. Something's happened there. So basically, they've decided to just make their own game. I guess self-funded. I'm not too sure. I mean, again, the businessman, he's signed these huge, crazy deals with like huge, massive Japanese investment banks. He's doing some project with the Japanese government. Like, I don't know, like it's all. I remember we were talking about it, right? It doesn't like you. There is so much stuff going on with his company that it's really confusing. But he seems to be getting a lot of investment from these side projects that he's then kind of funneling into what they've made. And like even the Paralympic game, he's spun that off now, and the engine they use, they've now made into Unreal Engine middleware that you can buy to make as a game engine. Like, yeah. I don't know. So I think it was like a couple of months ago it came out he was making an NFT game. Right, and of course that was like, it's kind of like with 16 and the sales, like, oh, Tabata, something he's doing that aligns with something else that people don't like. Yeah, get that stick out, whack it. But and like, you know, obviously people didn't really have too much context around what he was actually doing. It's people hear NFTs, they hear Web3, and they're like, oh no, this is exactly what we expected from this guy. He's a joke. But again, like no context. And so he's just done an interview with 4Gamer. They've announced their game. I think it's called the Gemina Games or Gemini Games or something like that. It's a I can't fully remember the title of it. But it is like it's a Web3 game. But we were walking through the interview, and so it's with 4Gamer, and the first thing they asked was like, so, you know, there's been lots of Web3 games come out. Is it going to be similar to this game, or is it going to be similar to this game? And he basically said, I don't know. I don't play any of those games because they're not very good. Like, yeah, kind of, exactly. And that was very much the sentiment. He was like, people make those Web3 games not to make a good game. They make it to try and, like, it's like a get rich quick scheme. Like, play this game, play to earn. You'll make loads of money playing these games, and you can do all this and you can do all that. And he basically in the interview said most Web3 games are like a Ponzi scheme, and that's not the vibe that I'm going for here. And he was basically talking about what they want to make, and it seems like much more like, if you think about the concept of the NFTs and the blockchain and stuff, and what it could be used for in terms of like, let's say you are playing Final Fantasy 14, right, and they introduce 100 weapons that can be traded for real money, right? That's no different from trading things in the real world. It's I can have a pair of trainers, and you want those pair of trainers, well, I can sell it to you, right? And there's only a certain number of them have been made. Like, that's how it works. And that's kind of how I thought the NFTs were going to work, but they just haven't gone that way at all. Right. But so his I don't fully understand it because it's in Japanese and we're trying to translate. But he's basically said that he's going to use the NFTs as a way of storing what your character has accomplished. So he was basically like, when you're playing a game, and especially like a PvP game, you don't really remember what you've done. Like if you're playing a League of Legends or a Counter-Strike or even like Marvel Snap, you don't remember the people you've played against. You don't remember like, how well you did in your like 4th ever game. You don't know if someone that you played against, like when you were starting out, or even more recently, it goes on to do something amazing in the world. But he wants to use the game to store all that information. And then I believe, like conceptually, it was like, so you have a sword and you use this sword to defeat this person and that person maybe ended up becoming one of the best players in the world, right? That sword then becomes valuable to someone. Maybe that person who's become the best player in the world wants to buy that sword as a memento of that wonderful time that he lost to a noob. Or maybe there's other people that like place value in that. Just like in the real world, fans place value on things connected to their favorite franchises, merchandise. You get something signed by a voice actor, suddenly it's worth way more money, right? It's just people have emotional connections to these things, and what those things have been through adds to the story of that. And so he's basically trying to make a game where it's like a PvP game, but there's a huge story element based on what you've done in that game, who you fought against, and like if you get right, like if you keep having to fight against the same person repeatedly, like the game will do something different, kind of thing. And like by the end of the interview, the guy who's interviewing was just like, this doesn't really sound like any kind of Web3 game I've ever experienced before. Like, and it was like, maybe like this is the game that's gonna dispel the negativity, like, because there's not many people making these games that actually come from a big game development background. Most of them are like, there are so many people on Twitter that do it, like, saying like, play to earn's the future of the gaming, and it's like, no, you just don't understand why people even play games in the first place. They play games to make money. Like if that's a byproduct, fine, whatever. But like no one really plays games to make money. They play games because they want to relax, they want to escape, they want to do all these other things. And I think the hope is that that's kind of what he's going to make. It's just apparently won a load of awards. I don't know. Yeah, like I don't think it's going to be a Kickstarter game. I know someone mentioned that. I think like they because of the way they work, like it's probably going to be like a self-funded thing. Like and who knows? It may end up being a complete disaster, right? Like with Tabata, it can go one of two ways. You have Type 0, and then you have Final Fantasy Agate, or you have Final Fantasy Type 0 online, which apparently did very well in China, but nowhere else. And then Guitars cancelled it when
I forgot that existed.
Yeah.
God.
But yeah, he's done lots of positive. He's been responsible for lots of positive games. Like Before Crisis was really successful in Japan. Crisis Core, kind of beloved. I don't really know the sentiment around Kingdom Hearts Coded or Recoded. But like Type 0 is a lot of people really like that game. There's a lot of people that love 15 as well.
Right.
And there's elements of the 15 universe that people also really like. There are elements that people don't like, but yeah, like Kingsglaive for what it was amazing. Yeah, there are clear issues with that and the continuity with the game.
Yes.
But for what its purpose was, Brotherhood, great series. People like and like he learned as well. Like the DLC, Episode Gladiolus was probably the weakest DLC, but each piece of DLC got progressively better. People love Episode Ignis.
Yeah.
Like Comrades did so well, they even made it a standalone game that you could buy separately.
Yeah. I mean, Episode Ignis was arguably better than the base game. I enjoyed it more. I think like as its own narrative and like as its own thing, like it was probably the best. I think there's a troll in here that I am quite familiar with.
Snuck in there.
Actually,
but no. So like with Tabata, I kind of want him to do well, but there's a chance this game may be a complete disaster. But who knows, right? It's one of those things where like he has the potential to succeed, and like as we said, like a lot of people from Luminous actually moved over to JP. They're at this new company. They're overseeing these projects. So there's a lot of pedigree in there. Like these are people that have worked on the Type Zeros and the Crisis Cores over the years, and they were also the part of the good elements of 15. Like people really love EOS. Right. Like there are some really good parts of EOS. People like the characters. Like the the AI and the technology that worked behind the scenes to have the characters interact with each other was like top tier. Like they did loads of talks at GDC about the technology they used, and they had really good relationships with GeForce. Like, you know, the Windows edition was really advanced. Right. There was a lot of stuff they did that was really good, and you know, if they can manifest that and make a Web3 NFT game that people, it's so good that people can't criticize it, then that would be like some kind of miracle,
right? Because that's going to happen. I mean, that's what it would take. And Japan has been really big on Web3. Like they have been extremely insistent. I think their government even has like subsidies and other incentives available, at least from what I've heard. So they're really big on pushing it. So
Susie, you'll be pleased to know that I believe the director, who is it, Ryan? Like the director and like the character artist, the person that made all the characters of Agnes Philosophy and came up with the concept, they've also joined JP Games.
Yep. And I mean, when you showed me how many people joined JP Games, originally I thought that Dawn of the Future was canceled simply because Tabata left, right? And they did not want to continue without Tabata. And that's kind of the way that Square kind of played the card. However, when you look into it, it's not because Tabata left. It's because almost all their like top level senior staff left with him. And they weren't there to actually even finish the DLC. Like a few dozen people left with Tabby. I didn't know this until Darryl told me.
I mean, it may have been more, right? They've just kind of declared who the senior people are that have jumped over. It may have been more. And like, you know, you saw it with the episode Arden 2 because the people that suddenly got promoted to the story weren't the people that were overseeing the story necessarily before. And, you know, I remember in interviews, they were kind of like wishy-washy on some details and like, you know, it wasn't all that consistent. And then Dawn of the Future, the novel, was then written by someone else. Like it would be like, you know, like Nojima not being involved with like the Final Fantasy VII novels,
right?
Just get some other random person. Like you can figure out the law.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. Yeah. So I think them probably. I get the decision behind canceling the DLC and just saying, hey, you know what, we'll just focus on this new IP. You know, we'll promote like a whole bunch of staff and kind of let them do it. So
I seem to remember as well, in our last chat, we did speak about Forspoken a little bit and its early days and how obviously, it was a project that Tabata was overseeing. It was a director and like there were probably some senior staff members who were also working on that hightailed out of there, which is why it probably went through that kind of identity change, right? The Tabata worked with what's his name, Gary, on the story, and they all hightailed out of there. They left, and then the people that took it over were like, "Well, we don't really like the story anymore. Can you rewrite it?" And he was like, "No, I can't rewrite it, but these people probably can." And then back and forth.
Yep. And that's how we ended up with the Forspoken that we have today. Because my reaction to Forspoken is like, certainly this game is going to be tremendously better than Final Fantasy 15 because it's a similar style of game. It's an open world action game. They're going to take everything that they learned from Final Fantasy 15 and they're going to make a tremendously better game. And then the game came out. And it was definitely not
it was supposed to be the game that they couldn't make with 15,
right?
Because 15 they inherited so much stuff that they had to work with,
right,
and make sense, appease the fan base that wanted Versus 13 as much as possible. Whereas 15, it was supposed to be that game that Forspoken was it was supposed to be. This is the game they made. It was the first time that Tabata had ever had the chance to work on a new IP that he had come up with in his entire career. Like, you know, and like, you know, if you think about it from his perspective, he threw that away. Like he was so dead set on leaving that he left that opportunity behind.
Right. And we still don't really have like a finite reason for him leaving, do we?
Not really. There's kind of speculations. He's done a few interviews, but I don't think he really wants to. I don't think he really wants to talk about it.
Right, and I doubt he wants to burn those bridges either. Most people don't.
No.
So, this is the big boy here. We'll kind of segue into. So we've had Tabata, we've had Yoshi P and Takai, we've had Kitase and Nomura. Who do you believe is working on Final Fantasy 17?
I'll say who I want to be working on it.
Please. Please. Go ahead.
I want it to be CBU3 again. Because I think, people are well within their rights to criticize 16, right?
Right.
Perfect. Like, I don't have any problem with people criticizing. I know we spoke before about, where the criticism comes from and stuff, but like, ultimately people can say whatever they want. But how I feel is that, this was CBE3's first ever attempt really at making an offline game of this scale. Right. There are obviously some people like Takai had worked on The Last Remnant and some other games in the past, like Final Fantasy V and stuff. So, and he'd also worked on some of the Saga or Mana games. I think of Saga. But like, it was their first chance to do this. And the fact that their first attempt was like, a near 90 plus game,
right,
from critics is incredibly commendable. What I would love to see, though, is exactly what we've been talking about: consistency, iteration. Right, give them the chance to take what they did with 16 and make it better. Right, make like do the typical Final Fantasy style, new setting, new whatever, all that kind of stuff. But iterate on the game, evolve the combat system, but keep it similar at its core. Like, fix the things that people are complaining about. Make a much better crafting system. Like, I didn't personally have a problem with the side quests, but there's people that have certain feelings about the side quests. Sort that out. These are theoretically like quite easy things to fix.
Yeah.
Right. Like, make the side quests a bit more compelling mechanically. Make the crafting system a bit more advanced. Tweak the difficulty options. These aren't like massive, like, we're going to take 5 years to solve these problems kind of things, right? It's
right.
They're even like most of us know what they need to do to solve these problems.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, I don't want to have too much hubris, but I feel like I could go in there and be like, okay, guys, Final Fantasy 16 2. Here's how we're gonna fix like the current thing, right? It seems like there's a lot of obvious things that they could change to make it a fundamentally more engaging game. There's a lot of things that you mentioned, kind of like the crafting system. I think too, like what one of the things that I would have thought of is maybe if not different weapon types, but at least different weapon abilities attached to each weapon, so that now that there is a value in weapons, there is something in the world that you're on the lookout for and that you're kind of like, hunting for. And in that way, you can use those weapon abilities and find different stuff or things like that.
I would like to see them get a second bite of the cherry.
Yeah.
And like, we've got the remake iteration, right? We know there's going to be another 2 games for that. They're kind of locked in. I would love to see that CBU 3 be locked in on the other path, so that whatever decision Square Enix have made, they stick to it. They commit to this being the two essentially channels of Final Fantasy. We've got CBU 1's version of Final Fantasy over here. We've got CBU 3's version of Final Fantasy over here, and let them do their thing, and like, have them kind of compete against each other, and like whoever wins out in the end, right?
Right.
Because it's kind of like what was happening. It's what Sakaguchi wanted to happen way back when, right? Because you had Katase's Final Fantasy and you had Ito's Final Fantasy, right? They were very different. And if Sakaguchi had stayed, we would have really got to see that manifest. I'm pretty convinced that 12 would have been a fundamentally different game than the one that we got had Sakaguchi stayed. And like, you know, you had like 7, 8, and 10, right? And then 13 obviously was the next iteration. Again, that was again a fundamentally different game than what it would have been if Sakaguchi probably would have stayed. And then you had 6, 9, and 12, which were kind of Ito's vision of things, more from a game. Like 9 was probably like the purest vision of what Ito wanted to do, because that was the one where he was obviously the sole director, whereas 6 he was co-director and 12 he was co-director. But like, you know, there was definitely those two schools of game. Like Sakaguchi was very aware that they had 2 different types of fan, right? There were the fans of Katase's games who was like the new blood. They'd come in with 7 and they stuck around because of 8 and 10. And then you had the kind of the old blood, the ones that had been there potentially since the beginning or had come in with like 4 or 5 or 6, and 9 was really made for them. And he wanted that to exist. And then obviously he had the MMO as well, which was like the third type of fan, and they wanted those different fan bases to be catered for. Whereas what we have now is like just it's kind of disparate. You know, I'm kind of glad that they've CPU 1, like you said before, like they kind of are forced to stick to something now, right? They can't keep upping and changing it around. Like they did it with Lightning Returns, like massively changed it. I don't think they'll be able to do that again with this one. Like I can't imagine the third game being like a wholesale massive gameplay change around where Cloud's the only protagonist that we play as and all this kind of stuff. Like they would not be able to do that. So like they're locked in with their workflow for the next, I don't know, 6 to 7 years. We've got two proper iterations for them. CBU 3, I would absolutely love it if they're already working on 17. They've been working on it for maybe a year or 2 behind the scenes, and it's a different. I know there's been people talking about New Blood. Well, the New Blood would be that they recycle talent out of 14, right? So that's how they made 16. They recycled. They removed people from 14, and they hired a load of new people. So like, I don't think many people have like really dug into the people that actually worked on 16, but you know, the combat system was made by someone who worked on like Tekken 7. You know, they pulled in people from like the story was obviously my hero was at the top, but you know, I think they had 2 or 3 people that worked on Persona 5, a couple of people that worked on Ni no Kuni. Like they had lots of new blood working on 16, and they were overseen by people that were from 14. They could easily do that again. Like the people that have been working on Shadowbringers and Endwalker, you know, put them into leadership positions on 17. Bring some new people in. You know, they got a big enough structure now that they can work on multiple projects at the same time. Like, you know, to me it makes sense that they can work that way. Then that's how they used to work, right? With 7, 8, and 10, you had prominent people in leadership positions, but there was always new people coming in to these games, and it's how they've always worked. Like if you look at any of the games, even from 1 through 6, it's only about half the development team that's actually people that already worked on a previous Final Fantasy game. Every single time they like double or they bring in a load of new people, or they pull people in from projects that aren't Final Fantasy. Katase, perfect example. His first game was Final Fantasy V, but he didn't join the company to work on Final Fantasy. He'd worked on another franchise before and moved over to 5.
Right.
And then he became part of the team that, because he did well, it was like a meritocracy system. Like Final Fantasies are peak premium property. You get promoted, you get chances to show what you can do. And like, you know, Nomura was similar. Like he was brought on board as a debugger. And then like they saw something in him and they chose to keep pushing him. How far can this guy go? You know, keep elevating his status, keep giving him more responsibilities. And like, you know, with CBE 3, it feels like that's very much the case, right? You know, Koji Fox moved away to work on 16. Someone else has come in to take his place, right? You know, she's done a really good job from what I understand since then. My hero, he was the narrative lead for A Realm Reborn and Heavensward. Stepped away to work on 16. You know, people that came in, took his place, have done a really good job. Like that's how you recycle in the new talent. And you know, now that with Dawn Trail, some of the people could step away, allow new people to start showing their vision of what 14 can be, keep that fresh, and then keep 17 fresh by Ishikawa, I think. Give her a chance to write a main series game, see what she can do. You know, that to me makes
that might
sense.
already be happening. She's not writing 7.0. She's not writing Dawn Trail, and she's moved into a supervising position, which is exactly what Koji did. And so it's kind of like how My Hero, he kind of just faded away from 14 after a while. And I have a feeling that Ishikawa is definitely the writer of Final Fantasy 17. I mean, just looking at how My Hero was able to scale up after Heavensward, right? To be the writer of Final Fantasy 16. When you look at Ishikawa and how her writing has been well received, I mean, she steps out on stage, and pretty much out of everyone on the development team for 14, she receives like the biggest round of applause. People love her. There's the viral clip of her at PAX East, and all she does is the only thing that she says is, "I'm the main scenario writer of Shadowbringers." The crowd just starts screaming for like a full minute straight and clapping. They love her. People love her. They love her work. And her work in Shadowbringers and in Walker has been like incredibly highly revered. So there's a lot of love for her. There's a lot of love for her work. I feel like making her write Final Fantasy 17 is just like the perfect thing to do. Now,
timeline wise, it kind of makes sense as well, right? Because if you think about with 14 and 16, you know, like Yoshida, Takai, and My Hero, they were kind of concepting 16 around like beginnings of Stormblood time, right? It was like, you know, 2016, 2017, from what we understand. So that was kind of, I think Stormblood was 2017 when that came out, right?
Yeah, it's 2017.
And so they were starting to kind of dial back on that, as we saw.
Right.
You know, if you take so they weren't really involved with Stormblood. Some of them still were, but it was primarily like Shadowbringers and Endwalker where they were just like, now we're out.
Yeah.
And let's say that, you know, Shadowbringers and Endwalker going through a similar phase here, where like as Endwalker is similar to Stormblood, let's say, there's kind of like phasing out, but they're already planning the next one theoretically. You know, that you know, Endwalker was 2021, right? That was a while ago now. It's 2 years ago now that came out. So theoretically, you know, they could have been doing lots of initial planning behind the scenes on the next one for some time, and now Endwalker, now obviously moving on to the next expansion, which has obviously got a longer lead time than they would have previously had for like Shadowbringers, because they're moving to a longer expansion releases, which obviously then actually gives them more time behind the scenes to figure these things out. You know, we could be in a situation where they could already be decent chunk through their start, and like there's no way it would take them as long to develop 17 as it would 16, because they started off with 16 as a cross-generational game. They didn't really know how to develop for the PlayStation 5 at all. They had to get a ton of support from Sony to do it all.
Yeah.
They had to start everything from scratch, essentially. Whereas now they don't have to do that anymore. And so, like, you know, you think about like the 7 Rebirth versus 7 Remake. They basically, like, 7 Rebirth is going to have been developed in about 2 years. Like, because Katase said they didn't really start working on it, actually properly development, until the PC version had been released. Because they did Intermission, and then the PC version was after that, I believe, right? Or was it the other way around? I can't remember which one. Either way, whichever one of those came last, that's when they kicked into gear.
The PC version
properly started working on Rebirth. And I believe that came out like 2021-ish, like mid 2021. So it's like 2.5 years for Rebirth, and it's going to be much bigger game, much bigger scale as well.
Right.
And you know, Katase has spoken about the fact that the reason they're only the reason they're doing 3 parts is because he had confidence that they could make this Rebirth really quickly and really cost effectively. And so I can't imagine that CPU 3 can't adopt a similar approach, right? The more you work on these games and you get used to architecture and stuff, the more confident you become, the quicker you can do things. That's just common
But
sense.
that's also a huge problem with the mainline series, though, right? Is because we keep taking them and then we keep throwing everything out. We throw out the tech, we throw out the engine, we throw out mechanics, gameplay systems, and then we just make everything new. And I know that there are some people that probably disagree with me on the idea of any type of like reuse in that way, but it's sort of like, you know, the human limits of being able to create things from scratch every single time and make sure that they're always perfect. At some point, even if they're the best developers in the world, that is very trying, and a lot of things can go wrong with all of those individual components, as we've seen.
And as you said, even the older games, right? They would reinvent certain systems, but other systems would be very similar. So like Final Fantasy VII, graphic system completely redone. New gameplay system with materia system. Obviously story is completely different as well. But the gameplay, like the core battle system, was pretty much the same, right? It was the ATB system. There were very few tweaks made to it mechanically. That was one thing that they knew, like, let's just keep it simple, keep it safe. We don't have to worry too much about it. Like the fact that they turned around Final Fantasy VII in a year is mental.
Right.
Like, I think the develop time of 7 was similar, if not less than 6.
Yeah.
Like it's crazy when you think about it like that. But they figured out how to make it work, and they did it in a smart way.
Right. But you can't really do that though, when every single time you have to come up with a completely new battle system that reflects nothing of the last thing that you just created.
Yep, and that's the unfortunate situation that they've got themselves in.
Yeah.
It could have been they had so many instances where they didn't need to do it, right? Because they could have like 12 and 13 different systems, fine, but like 15 could have had the same combat system as 13. Like, but they wanted to do the open. What they wanted to change the complete scope of the entire game because it was supposed to be a spin-off. Like, they wasn't supposed to be like a 13 successor. It wasn't supposed to be the next mainline entry into the series. Yeah. So they got forced into it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that would be my hope. I hope, or I want CBU 7, CBU 3 to be working on Final Fantasy 17.
The brand new secret CBU that you guys don't even know about. Just
for the consistency. I just want there to be consistency. And Final Fantasy 16 has done well enough, I think, for them to have that chance.
Yeah.
The decision obviously comes down to how quickly they can make it.
Yeah. So I'll give I think that CBU 3 should definitely develop another Final Fantasy, and I think they will. I don't know if it will be 17 or not. Because also too, I feel like it is somewhat time to also get like someone who is, and not just one person, but it might honestly be time to get a team that is like detached from like the old guard. Because I feel like that could also really help them to have. Is
that not like CBU 3 though? Because technically they are kind of attached from the old. Like, they've been at the company for a while, but Yoshida is not a Square employee.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, CBU 3 is the closest thing that's detached from the old guard. Like, whereas CBU 1 is like definitively the old guard. Like that is as old guard as it gets, right? But I do think that there may be some merit though in that as well. Baby Seal says, "Nah, they need to stick to other people's engines. I'm sorry. I like the charm of a proprietary engine, but it's just not feasible or worth it. There is nothing saying they have to stick to one. They can easily do Unreal or Decima easily." I mean, yeah. I mean, look at Kojima Studio. I believe they're also using Decima, which was made by Guerrilla Games. And
is that because they were forced to though? Because they obviously had a Fox engine, which they had to leave behind.
Well, they had to use something, and I think Guerrilla kind of volunteered their stuff. But personally, I'm cool with them using 16's engine again. I don't think it had tremendous problems other than kind of the frame rate issue at 60 frames per second, but that's fixable in the next iteration of that engine. That's not something that's out of reach for a game that's probably like 5 years away. So I think that I would be cool if CPU 3 does it. I'm kind of cool if anyone does it. I'm kind of cool if CPU 1 does it. I'm cool if they also have like, another team or another studio even.
It has to be soon, right? I think that's the other big mistake that's been happening. It's like, the fact that it's like 7 years between 15 and 16. Like
that's the problem. That's the problem. Yeah. And it's not, the problem is so not that that it needs to be the same team, that needs to be the same engine. There's just too much time between these games, and it feels like they need faster releases for Final Fantasy titles. And that's almost kind of why, and I thought on it. And they already had to have two teams right now. And two of those teams have been making two mainline Final Fantasies at once, at 14 and 16. But I kind of feel like if Final Fantasy is going to keep going at this rate, and they really want it to get to the way Kitase has kind of expressed it before is that they want that yearly Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed type release.
But they only managed that, right, because they had Infinity Ward and Treyarch and Sledgehammer all working on the games at the same time. But Black Ops was very different from Modern Warfare. They had the same core fundamentals, but Treyarch made different Call of Duties to Infinity Ward, right?
Yeah.
And Assassin's Creed, they leveraged the 50 billion studio network that they had.
All right. And so it may not be wrong for them to perhaps consider introducing a third Final Fantasy team that is entirely composed.
Who would that be though? There's people talking about
CPU2. It wouldn't be people that we probably need, right?
So CPU2 for everyone's reference is the Dragon Quest team. So so they're making Dragon Quest 12 right now.
Yeah, people always ask about the other CPUs and stuff like that. They particularly ask about 2 because everyone talks about 1 and 3. So they're like, what is 2? Although I'd totally be cool if CPU 2 made a Final Fantasy game. I think that would be that'd be Kino. Dragon Quest team, making
But then who would work on Dragon Quest?
Yeah, but then who would work on that's the problem, right? Is that you can't do that. But a Final Fantasy game made by them would be incredible. But again, that would take people off 12.
These are the examples, right? If you look at Sony's wider ecosystem, you have Naughty Dog, you have Insomniac, you have Guerrilla. They're all working on multiple games at the same time at a very high standard. Insomniac are working on Spider-Man 2, Wolverine, and it's rumored they're working on a third game as well. Mm-hmm. And they also turned out Miles Morales and Ratchet and Clank are Rift Apart at the same time. Pretty much.
Insomniac,
Naughty Dog are supposedly working on 3 games right now. Sucker Punch. They've got very well managed studios. And CPU 1 are working on the 7 Rebirth. They're working on Kingdom Hearts 4 at the same time. But it seems kind of, I don't know. We don't know when we're going to see Kingdom Hearts 4, right? Theoretically, that should be a 2024, 2025 release. But who knows? When's Dragon Quest 12 going to come out? So many questions.
I'm saying 2025 or even 6 for KH4.
No, it can't. It can't. They can't.
Well,
it has to be sooner.
They showed. I mean, the footage they showed was running on Unreal Engine 4. They said it was early development. I feel because a lot of people are trying to copium round it to closer, but I feel that is definitely not.
Imagine the shareholders though, right? So this year you've got 16 and 7 Rebirth in this financial year, plus a couple of like the Pixel remasters. You had I think Live Alive released this financial year, and then next year you've got Dragon Quest 12, you've got Kingdom Hearts 4, and you've got Dawn Trail. Yeah.
I mean,
money.
Their output is a lot better than what it was, right? Because if you recall,
like Final Fantasy 9 remake potentially as well. Tactics remaster, which will do amazingly well considering the Tactics Ogre remaster did like fantastically well. Like I think the difference now, like the output of Final Fantasy right now is at a massive low. Like in comparison to the entire Square Enix era, we're at a low point in terms of like output of Final Fantasy, which probably feels weird to say.
Yeah.
But like the number of games that we're actually having released is really low in comparison to what we would typically see, because they'd normally be churning out like mobile games and spin-offs, like the likes of Final Fantasy Explorers and like Record Keeper and all that stuff. They'd usually have a lot of those games coming out on every single year. There were points where we'd have like between 5 and 10 Final Fantasy games coming out a year. At the moment, we're down to like 2 or 3. But the difference is that what we're getting is much higher quality. Right. They're focusing on quality over quantity.
And I prefer that. I do.
Yes.
I prefer that so much stronger. Okay, so we're taking some audience questions now to round things out. Marsha Blue asked, where would you like the story for FF17 to go? I know that's kind of a difficult question to answer, so let me put my spin on it. What would you want the setting for FF17 to be?
I kind of like what they did with 16, because it was a game like even though thematically it was medieval, it was the exact same thing that we've seen for many years. There was the sci-fi element still, right? And I think that the balance of having that is nice. Could they have leaned a bit more into it? Probably. But I think like the overall setting was very similar to what we've seen before. Even like people are mentioning 10. I think it would be great to see like a more of an Asian setting, because we haven't had that really since then. But like even 10 had its sci-fi elements, right, because of the Machina, like and like the whole forbidden technology and all those kind of things. I think that's one of the core aspects of a Final Fantasy story narratively, or thematically, is that it has to have that kind of like yield. We use swords and stuff. You have the magic, and we're still using like crossbows and but then all of a sudden, like, oh, here's space travel.
Right.
Like,
yeah, I know that's so Final Fantasy. I think for me, if I had to pick a setting that I wanted, and like I've been saying this for a while, I would have feudal Japan, but for some reason there's also steampunk stuff going on. Type Next, right?
Yeah, that's what that was supposed to be.
Type Next, more or less. But yeah, I would have like Final Fantasy like samurai, and also for some reason he's a samurai with a gunblade. He's got a katana with the gun on it.
He's Vice, right?
Yeah. Does Vice have a gun on it?
Yeah, he has a gunblade.
Oh yeah. Should Final Fantasy lean into its M rating? Hard yes.
I think so. I mean, like it. I mean, you could argue that's actually been detrimental to its sales, right? It's an M-rated game. I mean, the comparisons with God of War. It's God of War M-rated.
Yeah, God of War. Yeah. God of War is definitely M-rated.
But like Horizon isn't, and like Spider-Man definitely isn't. So yeah, I mean, like I don't think it's really hurt it. And like that's kind of where people want to go. Yeah, like The Witcher 3. It doesn't seem to be necessarily a deterrent to sales anymore. Yeah, around it, like those games are selling tons.
Exactly. It's because there's so many gamers who are older than 18. and a lot of gamers who are younger than 18 who have parents.
GTA 5 sold like 170 million copies now.
Yeah. Damn, it would have sold so much more if it was T-rated. Sad. Which Final Fantasy would you most like to have remade? And what would you like it to be like? My answer is none. I want it to be like a thing that's not. And that's not to say that I'm not gonna love FF9 remake when it comes out. In fact, I'm willing to bet FF9 remake will be like the favorite, like my favorite probably thing that FF has probably put out probably in years, or at least since like Shadowbringers. But at the same time, though, too, like I get it. FF's past is really good. I'm more interested in FF's future and making sure that future is actually what I want it to be.
I think,
yeah,
I agree with you. I agree with you conceptually.
Yeah.
But I can't help but look at Capcom, right? They have been able to create a fantastic remake path.
Yeah.
And who knows if Resident Evil 5 remake's going to be next, or they're going to remake Code Veronica, or they're going to remake Zero. Like they've done a really good job of like leveraging the new games and the old games, and they've made the old games new at the same time, right?
Right.
And but Final Fantasy hasn't really again managed that. Like, you know, if they'd have been like, yeah, we're going to do a Final Fantasy 7 remake, and then we're going to do 8, and then we're going to do 9, we're going to do 10. It's going to be great, and there's going to be thematic development there, and you're going to have the remake like angle. Then that would have been great, because like like Capcom have managed to do this, and they've done it with Monster Hunter as well. Like everything they do works towards building that brand, like the Resident Evil brand. They're doing movies, animated shows, everything, all to try and build the Resident Evil brand as a collective unit. Whereas Final Fantasy's like, well, I'm doing this for my Final Fantasy, I'm doing this, and it's not going to connect, and you do that, and then I'll do this, and then no one knows. Like, you know, no one's talked about the fact that CBU 4 also works on Final Fantasy games. You know, like
but it's just like, I mean, but that's the thing though too. That's why Final Fantasy is so divisive in a sense, because no two people.
There's no person at the top being like, it's supposed to be Katase, right? But I mean, you know, there's
even Katase is like, yeah, do whatever.
Do whatever. Because Yoshida said, like, you know, I spoke to Katase and he was like, what should I do? And he was like, just do whatever you want, really. You know, like. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it's not like that behind the scenes. Or I hope it's not. But
that's, I mean, certainly the way he conveyed it, though, was, you know, do whatever. And I kind of, and I mean, someone mentioned like the Call of Duty FF, which has kind of become a meme that they're going to make like a Call of Duty like FF. But
very like, misinterpreted quote.
Yeah, but it's sort of like they could. Right, it's not like it's off limits at Square. More like, not that they actually anyone plans to really make a Call of Duty Final Fantasy. I
mean, like, you know, it's a thing. Like Resident Evil, they've made crossovers that kind of make sense. You know, and that's how Final Fantasy used to be. Like Tactics was a completely logical crossover game. And Chocobo's Dungeon was a completely logical crossover game. But then they started just being like, you know what, let's just you know, make a third person shooter. You know, that works.
Yeah. Do you guys think Hamaguchi could take over the next Mainline if it was CBU1? Do we not know his full potential as a director because of the remake project being like it is?
I don't really know what Hamaguchi represents.
Yeah, me neither. It's so hard to say.
Yeah, and it's kind of similar to Tabata in a way, because he's the director of Rebirth, and he was obviously the co-director of Remake, but he's not really. And it's kind of like it's like 16 in a way, right? Takai was the director of the game. Really, it was Yoshida's game. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
You know, Takai was there to deliver essentially on Yoshida's vision and My Hero's vision, like, you know, and I feel as though Hamaguchi's there to deliver Nomura and Katase's vision. Like
Right.
that's his job.
Right.
It's not Hamaguchi's vision. Like
Right.
we know at Rebirth, like he would make suggestions for things that he would want to see in the game, and they would need to be approved by Nomura and Kitase, and that's not going to have changed.
Right.
I think he may obviously has a bit more autonomy now, but Nomura is still there as the creative director. It's still very much his vision. He's not involved in the day-to-day and how it's actually manifesting and happening, but Rebirth is still going to be the game that Nomura wants it to be. And I don't really know what Hamaguchi, his game is, obviously we know that he was the one that wanted Sephiroth to be the end boss. So maybe he's like let's just go full wackadoo,
Yeah.
I think it's hard.
I think it's possible, but for him to kind of step into that director role, in a sense of him being a creative director, but I think it'll depend on how well the FF7R trilogy, particularly Rebirth onward, is received, and how the team ends up feeling about him and the success that's kind of laid out there. And I think if that really works in his favor, then I can totally imagine him taking over at that point.
He'll get a chance.
Yeah.
I imagine it's kind of similar to Toriyama, right? Because he had his chance to, Kitase stepped aside and was like, I'm going to let you direct 10-2. Kitase is obviously someone who gives a lot of autonomy to his directors, as opposed to being like a overarching executive producer who's like, you are making this game this way. And obviously, with 13, Toriyama had his chance to really do something, and it just didn't work out. And ultimately, that Toriyama has in the nicest way possible been relegated, right? And hopefully Hamaguchi, if this project goes well and Nomura and Kitase kind of believe in his talents, maybe he'll get the chance to work on a new IP, or maybe he'll get the chance to work on the next mainline numbered game. Yeah. But we're talking about that's not going to be for another 10 years. Yeah,
for sure. Subtext asks an interesting question. FF16 reviews made people question its MMO game design. Is there an unexpected non-FF IP that you think FF can take lessons from on a perspective of game design? Example, FF7R director referencing Horizon. Now, I'll just say, personally, I thought that when he mentioned God of War 2018 so much, Takai that is, I was thinking that this game was going to actually be a lot closer to God of War 2018 in its progression and the way that you discover things and in its RPG mechanics and how the world was, but it totally was not. And so, yeah, actually, I would say God of War 2018, but actually this time.
They just used it for the toggle mechanic, right?
That's the only thing they took was Atreus would make a great toggle, and then that's what they did. That's the only thing that was really taken from that. So, yeah, I would say that God of War, but for real.
Yeah.
Did you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, it's one of those things, isn't it? You can obviously take inspirations from other games, and that's ultimately how people come up with new ideas, isn't it? Right?
Mm-hmm.
No one comes up magically with a new idea with no source of reference or inspirations. It's generally the best ideas come from combining different elements in ways that have never been done before.
Right.
And obviously, with 16 they tried to do that, but not in the way that some people wanted them to do so. Right. But there's opportunities, right? If they are working on the next one, they can fix that.
All right, let's take a couple more. From Baby Seal, for both of you. Style aside, what story or political themes would you like Final Fantasy 17 to have? I would like, for personally speaking, the theme of samurai.
Are you talking about the actual or the Ronins? You could be a master of the sky who's just going around.
Oh, that was totally me being facetious. Because I really do want a Meiji era Japan Final Fantasy. Like I feel like that's like the perfect place to go off of the heels of like Final Fantasy 16. But then also too, I'm just telling you, put some steampunk in there for some reason, work it out. But it'll work, and it'll work. Yeah, it'll work for some. It kind of worked in 10, right? Like, you know, it's based on like, you know, like the specific islands, and then also too, there was Machina for some reason, right? So
because they needed to do
you know. So I feel like that's what I want. Thematically, they can kind of go anywhere. The only thing I kind of want them to avoid, you guys are going to crucify me for this. Only thing I want them to avoid is really like fighting Divine Fate, because I feel like that has been done in the past like 4 or 5 games, at least 13, 15, 7R, and 16. So
even going back further, right? You know, it's 9, it's 10.
Yeah, well, at least no, because kind of with 10, I feel like it was a bit more. With 10, it was played a little bit differently in such a way that I feel like
it was, but ultimately it was Yuna had her role, and she was going to play that role,
right?
And it wasn't like, well, I guess in the end she chose to make the decision to turn her back on her destiny.
Right. So I think if you could make something that is a lot less focused on like we have to defy fate in such an on the nose, over the top way, which like basically like amounts to the fact that we have to kill God, essentially, because I think 15 was better before they introduced Dawn of the Future. Bahamut is the real villain stuff, because I was like, I love that Arden is like the villain here, and not Divine Destiny, and then,
but then you know that was the whole thing. They wanted to appease the masses, right? Let's do a happy ending. Oh, actually, Arden's the good guy.
Yeah.
You know?
And it was God who actually, you know, was the bad guy, and then. So it actually dials back. It completely erased, you know, Arden being like this really stellar villain, and replaced that with God and defying
16
fate.
Definitely had shades of 13.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely did. So yeah,
and 15.
FF is about breaking oppression is unavoidable. That's a given. I mean, specifically things like slavery, climate change. Yeah. I think all that stuff's fine. I think that I just don't want it to be so on the nose about it, like the way it has been with recent titles. Yeah, I think that thematically is Final Fantasy, though.
The earlier games were like, there's someone in the world who's an evil dude who wants to destroy the world. And then sometimes there would be a crazy mystical power that comes in from nowhere that is like, actually, I'm the real bad guy. But, you know, like the likes of like Kefka and Sephiroth were just mean people that you needed to try and stop. And like, you know, I think for some of those more recent games, like Arden obviously was consistent, but like, you know, like 13, it's like, what am I really actually fighting for here?
Yeah. What I really like in particular is that I like the antagonist who really have like their own deeper emotional reasons to be fighting, like Emmett Selk, for example, right? With Emmett, it was all about his people and their land and trying to basically restore their world, right?
Sounds very similar to a certain game that we just played. Right.
Yeah, but delivered in a more human way, right? Which kind of makes you think too, like if they had just portrayed Ultima in such a light that was more like Emmett Selk, where it was more like a thing that you can kind of identify with and recognize, you know, the plight of another living being, although he's technically not human. I feel like that would have actually been a lot better, right? But I can say that Ultima, at least, I understood a lot better than like Orphan.
Yes.
Because Orphan was like straight up incomprehensible.
And then it gets even more confusing with Etro and Benevelza and...
Yeah. Very, very incomprehensible unless you like really read into the lore and you kind of go deep into it. But aside from that, yeah, I kind of want I want a villain who, or not even necessarily a villain in the same sense, but an antagonist or a force that is something that has its reasons that are deeper than the sort of shallowly portrayed reasons that I feel like we've gotten a lot of recently.
I feel as though 16 actually did tackle it in quite a good way. It's just, I mean, like if you think about thematically with Final Fantasy games, usually the main big bad, the final bad guy is not really that strong of a character.
Yeah,
it's the other antagonists, you know, Kefra and Sephiroth are kind of exceptions as opposed to the rule.
Right.
You know, if you think about 16, like Hugo is a great villain. You know, you understand his motivations, why he's doing the things he is, and like, yeah, he's a bit of a dolt, but you can understand, you know, why he's taking the route. Like Annabella, fantastic villain. Like she is like just the spawn of evil.
Right. See,
and again, you can understand her completely. Like she explains her motivation. She's very clear about it, and you know she is a despicable human being.
Right.
And like Barnabas even as well. Like you know great character. Like the antagonists in 16 were really really strong. And probably some of the strongest we've had as a collective unit in the franchise as a whole. And then like obviously Ultima is kind of there, and it like. Probably isn't a fair comparison, but he's more there as the contemporary to like the Necrons, the Cloud of Darknesses.
Yeah.
You know,
he's a callback to those villains,
and also Ultima from Tactics, right? It's
right.
Very, very, very clear callback to that one.
There's like, you know, like, and this is what makes all the Game of Thrones comparisons so funny to me is that there's basically no villain that I could think of that is more Final Fantasy than Ultima. And the way they showed it, the way they portrayed him in 16, it was just like, it was almost painfully Final Fantasy. To a point of where I was like, dude, please turn down the Final Fantasy. It's too much. It's too much. I actually kind of liked the Game of Thrones a little bit more in this case than the Final Fantasy.
When it was revealed that the main bad guy was Ultima, I was just like, well, didn't see that coming. Well, I should have seen that coming.
Yeah, like
my hero. It's like there's only like it's like Chaos appearing as the main bad guy again, just randomly. It's like,
but it's such like a CBU one trope for Ultima. I feel like to be kind of like the villain, but did I say 1? I meant 3.
You said 1. Yeah.
I said 1. I meant CBU 3. I kind of just like processed what I said.
Hey, they just keep recycling Sephiroth again.
Yeah.
So it's all good.
Bottom line though, I'm a really big fan of villains like Caius or Arden, Emmett Selk, and I'm gonna throw this one out there because there are people who love him and there's people who hate him. I love him. Xenos, yay. Thunder Chad. He is like I love Xenos. But I love those types of villains. And I feel like whenever the villain is less of a villain in the sense of I want to just destroy the world, or even less of like the Kefka or Sephiroth, right? Because even the Kefka or Sephiroth, they're good force of nature villains, but like if you actually peel them back as like characters, they're not deep. They're not like, you can't.
No, I mean,
right?
Sephiroth, according to Crisis Core, like his entire character is built around the fact that Zack asked him a question.
Right. And so I really like villains And villain is honestly even a loose word here because they're antagonists, really. And they do commit villainous actions, which is kind of like what allows you to justify, defeating them in the end. But I like these characters who essentially what they do is they have deep emotional reasons to be fighting that they cannot back down from, like
Seymour is another great example, right? Seymour's a fantastic villain,
right? The fact that he was trying to save everyone in his twisted way,
in his own way, yeah,
right. And I feel like there's something more human about that because it is more human, to be frank, rather than
and that's Caius is the same, right?
Right.
He just wanted to stop having to see Yule die because he was given this gift that he never asked for.
Right. Like there's something that like Emmett says like in the final fight with him that I like really hold on to, where he's like basically saying, I have to bear every burden, every prayer of my people. And like it hurts, but it hurts in a way that you feel, that you relate to, that you empathize with, because you have this man who is like, I'm not going to let, essentially my entire, all of the ancients go extinct. And that's also why that final line, that's kind of, you see it posted everywhere, remember us, remember that we once lived, right? At the end of that fight, he's kind of just like, I want you to just ultimately remember me, remember our people, and don't erase us from history, right? You're crying, basically. It's just like crying at the end of this like fight, right? Like I teared up. Like you can watch my stream highlights on it. I was in tears, right? And how many times? Like I don't think that like defeating like I'm not gonna cry in Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 when I beat Sephiroth, or I definitely didn't. I don't cry
unless they pull like something miraculous,
right?
Yeah.
Or Kefka, right? Like you're not in tears over Kefka, right? Or even Xenos. Not to go all the way into like Inwalk or spoilers, but defeating Xenos is also like really, really emotional too. Defeating Caius in a way was also like a super emotional fight. So I do think that humanizing villains and can be powerful. Baby Seal says humanizing villains is very effective, but I think not every villain needs to be that way. I think Ultima was more a reflection of our less empathetic selves. Yeah, I totally get it at looking at it from a higher level. But I think
I think it's like depends on that story they want to tell, right? You know, Final Fantasy 16 was a game that affected me emotionally, not really because of Ultima, but because of everything else that the characters go through, and sometimes like you just need a motivation, right? And that's ultimately what Ultima was. He was a motivation for the characters to do things, because for the longest time, Clive is just his objectives change, right, as he goes through. It's not like the older games where, like, Final Fantasy 7, Cloud's objective is stop Sephiroth.
Right.
For the longest part of that game is we've got to stop Sephiroth. Like as soon as you leave Midgard, that's your objective. And like a lot of the other games, it's like it's very one-dimensional focus, like party forms, stop evil plan. And like the games that I think have done it the best way, like 10, the objective was changing quite a lot, right? It was always defeat sin, but how to do that and why you did it was obviously the thing that changed.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think that's why it became emotional, because as it kind of got closer to the end, you're like, okay, you realize that if you win, Tidus dies, right? And you got the fight where Tidus reconciles with his dad, who he has to kill. Like there's all these so many different elements to it that make it that just make it so powerful. And obviously, like ultimately, it's all Yuna's decision too. Like she has to choose to go against the entire cultural beliefs of her planet.
Yeah. Yeah.
to like take a risk essentially, because some guy from some place that is made up is like, nah, you shouldn't do this.
Yep. Yeah, so I would like to see less about you know, God orchestrating things from behind the scenes, and less about you know, just evil God in general, and more commentary about man and what man is doing and why man,
which is
goes
kind of
against each
16,
other.
right?
Yeah,
that's what 16 was.
right.
It
Like
was
if you trim off like the last third, right? Like, but that's why, and it's not to say that, because I think the commentary with Ultima is profound. Like if you look into it, if you think about it, if you look at like the sort of biblical symbolism that's happening there. However, I feel like it's not as interesting to me. It's never as interesting to me as just men, humanity, you know? That's why, you know, Hugo versus Clive. It's profoundly more interesting than Clive versus Ultima, right?
But you know, 16 is very similar structurally to Tactics, right? For a long time in Tactics, it's the different human factions fighting against each other, and you know, the amount of political intrigue that exists within that game is insane. Why the conflict's even happening in the first place is all about a succession to the throne and all this stuff, which kind of gets lost unless you really, because it's not massively necessary to the plot. But obviously it's nice to know why you're fighting and why everyone's killing each other. But like, you know, you get to that final third and all of a sudden it's like, actually no, the plot isn't really about the succession to the throne. It's not really about who's going to win the war. It's about, there's a group of powerful demons that are trying to be resurrected, and they're going to try and destroy the world. I'm thinking, and like, you know, so from that angle, it's very similar. Like, you know, they're like, it's kind of like, you know, those comparisons with the Rocky movies where they put them like side by side, and they're like, at this point Rocky's doing this, and then he's going to go through this phase, and he's going to go through this phase. I swear, if you put like Tactics and 16 kind of like side by side in terms of what actually happens in the story when, it's got to be very similar. Because like for 16 you've got the different nations all fighting against each other for different motivational reasons and stuff, and then at some point, actually no, there's another thing happening over here that someone's trying to be resurrected. It's called Ultima. Hey. We obviously didn't get to see the other. They didn't give the names to the other because they just called them all Ultima. Let's save some time there. But like, you know, it's very, very similar. Like they were ultimately trying to resurrect themselves and bring about a new land, and that's what Tactics was kind of about too.
Right.
Like, it wasn't really about the war that was happening in Ivalice. It was just like a byproduct to get you like invested in everything.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's going to just about do it today. We've been going for 3 hours now, which is crazy. Closing comments, and also tell us where we can find you. As if everyone in here doesn't already follow, but just in case they don't, let them know, please.
So if you search for Final Fantasy Union anywhere, you will find us. YouTube, X, I believe it's called now. Twitter, probably the more professional name for the moment. But yeah, mostly YouTube. That's kind of where we sit. But yeah, great chat.
Yeah, excellent.
Love diving into stuff. Love educating on Tabata. Hopefully, fingers crossed, his stuff works out well. But if not, then oh well.
For all the Web3 fans in the chat. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us, to the YouTube audience. I hope you guys have a great day, and also be sure to check out my latest upload, and be sure to check out Final Fantasy Union.